Chapter 10 of The Poisoned Pen by Arthur B. Reeve. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elliott Miller. The Smuggler. It was a rather sultry afternoon in the late summer, when people who had calculated by the calendar rather than by the weather were returning to the city from the seashore, the mountains, and abroad. Except for the weekends, Kennedy and I had been pretty busy, though on this particular day there was a lull in the succession of cases which had demanded our urgent attention during the summer. We had met at the public library where Craig was doing some special research at odd moments in criminology. Fifth Avenue was still half deserted, though the few pedestrians who had returned or remained in town like ourselves were, as usual, to be found mostly on the west side of the street. Nearly everybody, I have noticed, walks on the one side of Fifth Avenue, winter or summer. As we stood on the corner waiting for the traffic man's whistle to halt the crush of automobiles, a man on the top of a bus waved to Kennedy. I looked up and caught a glimpse of Jack Herndon, an old college mate, who had had some political aspirations and had recently been appointed to a position in the Customs House of New York. Herndon, I may add, represented the younger and clean-cut generation which is entering official life with great advantage to both themselves and politics. The bus pulled up to the curb, and Jack tore down the breakneck steps hurriedly.
"I was just thinking of you, Craig," he beamed as we all shook hands, "and wondering whether you and Walter were in town. I think I should have come up to see you tonight, anyhow."
"Why, what's the matter? More sugar frauds?" laughed Kennedy. "Or perhaps you have caught another art dealer red-handed?"
"No, not exactly," replied Herndon, growing graver for the moment. "We're having a big shake-up down at the office. None of your new broom business, either. Real reform it is this time."
"And you, are you going or coming?" inquired Craig with an interested twinkle.
"Coming, Craig, coming," answered Jack enthusiastically. "They've put me in charge of a sort of detective force as a special deputy surveyor to rout out some of the smuggling that we know is going on. If I make good, it will go a long way for me, with all this talk of efficiency and economy down in Washington these days."
"What's on your mind now?" asked Kennedy observantly. "Can I help you in any way?" Herndon had taken each of us by an arm and walked us over to a stone bench in the shade of the library building.
"You have read the accounts in the afternoon papers of the peculiar death of Mademoiselle Violette, the little French modiste, up here on 46th Street?" he inquired.
"Yes," answered Kennedy. "What has that to do with customs reform?"
"A good deal, I fear," Herndon continued. "It's part of a case that has been bothering us all summer. It's the first really big thing I've been up against, and it's as ticklish as a bit of business as even a veteran Treasury agent could wish."
Herndon looked thoughtfully at the passing crowd on the other side of the balustrade, and continued.
"It started, like many of our cases, with the anonymous letter writer. Early in the summer the letters began to come into the deputy surveyor's office, all unsigned, though quite evidently written in a woman's hand, disguised, of course, and on rather dainty notepaper. They warned us of a big plot to smuggle gowns and jewelry from Paris. Smuggling jewelry is pretty common because jewels take up little space and are very valuable. Perhaps it doesn't sound to you like a big thing to smuggle dresses, but when you realize that one of those filmy, lacy creations may often be worth several hundred, if not $1,000, and that it needs only a few of them on each ship that comes in to run up into the thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands in a season, you will see how essential it is to break up that sort of thing. We've been getting after the individual pirate smugglers pretty sharply this summer, and we've had lots of criticism. If we could land a big fellow and make an object lesson of the extent of the thing, I believe it would leave our critics of the press without a leg to stand on. At least, that was why I was interested in the letters. But it was not until a few days ago that we got a tip that gave us a real working clue, for the anonymous letters had been very vague as to names, dates, and places, though bold enough as to general charges, as if the writer were fearful of incriminating himself or herself. Strange to say, this new clue came from the wife of one of the customs men. She happened to be in a Broadway manicure shop one day when she heard a woman talking with the manicurist about fall styles, and she was all attention when she heard the customer say, "You remember Mademoiselle Violette's, that place that had the exquisite things straight from Paris, and so cheaply too? Well, Violette says she'll have to raise her prices so that they will be nearly as high as the regular stores. She says the tariff has gone up or something, but it hasn't, has it?" The manicurist laughed knowingly, and the next remark caught the woman's attention. "No, indeed, but then I guess she meant that she had to pay her duty now. You know they are getting much stricter. To tell the truth, I imagine most of Violette's goods were, well, smuggled," supplied the customer in an undertone. The manicurist gave a slight shrug of the shoulders and a bright little yes of a laugh. That was all, but it was enough. I set a special customs officer to watch Mademoiselle, a clever fellow. He didn't have time to find out much, but on the other hand, I am sure he didn't do anything to alarm Mademoiselle. That would have been a bad game. His case was progressing favorably, and he had become acquainted with one of the girls who worked in the shop. We might have got some evidence, but suddenly this morning he walked up to my desk and handed me an early edition of the afternoon paper. Mademoiselle Violette had been discovered dead in her shop by the girls when they came to work this morning. Apparently, she had been there all night, but the report was quite indefinite, and I am on my way up there now to meet the coroner, who has agreed to wait for me.
"You think there is some connection between her death and the letters?" put in Craig.
"Of course I can't say yet," answered Herndon dubiously. "The papers seem to think it was a suicide, but then why should she commit suicide? My men found out that among the girls it was common gossip that she was to marry Jean Pierre, the Fifth Avenue jeweler, of the firm of Lang and Pierre down on the next block. Pierre is due in New York on La Montaigne tonight or tomorrow morning. Why, if my suspicions are correct, it is this Pierre who is the brains of the whole affair. And here's another thing. You know we have a sort of secret service in Paris and other European cities which is constantly keeping an eye on purchases of goods by Americans abroad. Well, the chief of our men in Paris cables me that Pierre is known to have made extraordinarily heavy purchases of made-up jewelry this season. For one thing, we believe he has acquired from a syndicate a rather famous diamond necklace, which it has taken years to assemble and match up, worth about $300,000. You know the duty on made-up jewelry is 60%, and even if he bought the stones in loose, it would be 10%, which on a valuation of, say, $200,000 means $20,000 duty alone. Then he has a splendid dog collar of pearls, and a lot of other stuff. I know, because we get our tips from all sorts of sources, and they're usually pretty straight. Some come from dealers who are sore about not making sales themselves. So you see there's a good deal at stake in this case, and it may be that in following it out we shall kill more than one bird. I wish you'd come along with me up to Mademoiselle Violette's and give me an opinion."
Craig had already risen from the bench, and we were walking up the avenue. The establishment of Mademoiselle Violette consisted of a 3-story and basement brownstone house, in which the basement and first floor had been remodeled for business purposes. Mademoiselle's place, which was on the first floor, was announced to the world by a neat little oval gilt sign on the hand railing of the steps. We ascended and rang the bell. As we waited, I noticed that there were several other modesties on the same street, while almost directly across was a sign which proclaimed that on September 15th Mademoiselle Gabrielle would open with a high-class exhibition of imported gowns from Paris. We entered. The coroner and an undertaker were already there, and the former was expecting Herndon. Kennedy and I had already met him, and he shook hands cordially. Mademoiselle Violette, it seemed, had rented the entire house and then had sublet the basement to a milliner, using the first floor herself, the second as a workroom for the girls whom she employed, while she lived on the top floor. which had been fitted for light housekeeping with a kitchenette. It was in the back room of the shop itself on the first floor that her body had been discovered, lying on a davenport. "The newspaper reports were very indefinite," began Herndon, endeavouring to take in the situation. "I suppose they told nearly all the story, but what caused her death? Have you found out yet? Was it poison or violence?" The coroner said nothing, but with a significant glance at Kennedy, he drew a peculiar contrivance from his pocket. It had 4 round holes in it, and through each hole he slipped a finger, then closed his hand, and exhibited his clenched fist. It looked as if he wore a series of 4 metal rings on his fingers. "Brass knuckles?" suggested Herndon, looking hastily at the body, which showed not a sign of violence on the stony face. The coroner shook his head knowingly. Suddenly he raised his fist. I saw him press hard with his thumb on the upper end of the metal contrivance. From the other end, just concealed under his little finger, there shot out, as if released by a magic spring, a thin, keen little blade of the brightest and toughest steel. He was holding, instead of a meaningless contrivance of 4 rings, a most dangerous kind of stiletto, or dagger upraised. He lifted his thumb and the blade sprang back into its sheath like an extinguished spark of light. "An Apache dagger, such as is used in the underworld of Paris," broke out Kennedy, his eyes gleaming with interest. The coroner added, "We found it," he said, "clasped loosely in her hand, but it is only by expert medical testimony that we can determine whether it was placed on her fingers before or after this happened. We have photographed it, and the prints are being developed." He had now uncovered the slight figure of the little French modiste. On the dress, instead of the profuse flow of blood which we had expected to see, there was a single round spot, and in the white marble skin of her breast was a little, nearly microscopic puncture directly over the heart. "She must have died almost instantly," commented Kennedy, glancing from the Apache weapon to the dead woman and back again. "Internal hemorrhage. I suppose you have searched her effects. Have you found anything that gives a hint among them?" "No," replied the coroner doubtfully. "I can't say we have, unless it's the bundle of letters from Pierre, the jeweller. They seem to have been engaged, and yet the letters stopped abruptly, and, well, from the tone of the last one from him, I should say there was a quarrel brewing." An exclamation from Herndon followed. "The same notepaper and the same handwriting as the anonymous letters," he cried. But that was all. Go over the ground as Kennedy might, he could find nothing further than the coroner and Herndon had already revealed. "About these people, Lang and Pierre," asked Craig thoughtfully, when we had left Mademoiselle's and were riding downtown to the customs house with Herndon. "What do you know about them? I presume that Lang is in America, if his partner is abroad." "Yes, he's here in New York. I believe the firm has a rather unsavory reputation. They have to be watched, I am told. Then, too, one or the other of the partners makes frequent trips abroad, mostly Pierre. Pierre, as you see, was very intimate with Mademoiselle, and the letters simply confirm what the girls told my detective. He was believed to be engaged to her, and I see no reason now to doubt that. The fact is, Kennedy, it wouldn't surprise me in the least to learn that it was he who engineered the smuggling for her as well as himself." "What about the partner? What role does he play in your suspicions?" "That's another curious feature. Lang doesn't seem to bother much with the business. He's a sort of silent partner, although nominally the head of the firm. Still, they both seem always to be plentifully supplied with money and to have a good trade. Lang lives most of the time up on the west shore of the Hudson, and seems to be more interested in his position as commodore of the River Ledge Yacht Club than in his business down here. He's quite a sport, a great motorboat enthusiast, and has lately taken to hydroplanes." "I meant," repeated Kennedy, "what about Lang and Mademoiselle Violette? Were they friendly?" "Oh," replied Herndon, seeming to catch the idea. "I see. Of course, Pierre abroad and Lang here. I see what you mean. Why, the girl told my man that Mademoiselle Violette used to go motor boating with Lang. but only when her fiancé Pierre was along. No, I don't think she ever had anything to do with Lang, if that's what you're driving at. He may have paid attention to her, but Pierre was her lover, and I haven't a doubt but that if Lang made any advances she repelled them. She seems to have thought everything of Pierre. We had reached Herndon's office by this time, leaving word with his stenographer to get the very latest reports from La Montaigne. He continued talking to us about his work. "Dressmakers, milliners, and jewelers are our worst offenders now," he remarked, as we stood gazing out of the window at the panorama of the bay off the sea wall of the Battery. "Why, time and again we unearth what looks for all the world like a dressmaker's syndicate, though this case is the first I've had that involved a death. Really, I've come to look on smuggling as one of the fine arts among crimes. Once the smuggler, like the pirate and the highwayman, was a sort of gentleman rogue, but now it has become a very ladylike art. The extent of it is almost beyond belief, too. It begins with the steerage and runs right up to the absolute unblushing cynicism of the first cabin. I suppose you know that women, particularly a certain brand of society women, are the worst and most persistent offenders. Why, they even boast of it. Smuggling isn't merely popular, it's aristocratic. But we're going to take some of the flavor out of it before we finish." He tore open a cable message which a boy had brought in. "Now, take this for instance," he continued. "You remember the sign across the street from Mademoiselle Violette's, announcing that a Mademoiselle Gabrielle was going to open a salon or whatever they call it? Well, here's another cable from our Paris Secret Service with a belated tip. They tell us to look out for a Mademoiselle Gabrielle on La Montaigne, too. That's another interesting thing. You know, the various lines are all ranked, at least in our estimation, according to the likelihood of such offences being perpetrated by their passengers. We watch ships from London, Liverpool, and Paris most carefully. Scandinavian ships are the least likely to need watching. Well, Miss Roberts?" "We have just had a wireless about La Montaigne," reported his stenographer, who had entered while he was speaking, "and she is 300 miles east of Sandy Hook. She won't dock until tomorrow." "Thank you. Well, fellows, it's getting late, and that means nothing more doing tonight. Can you be here early in the morning? We'll go down to the bay and bring in the ship, as our men call it, when the deputy surveyor and his acting deputies go down to meet it at quarantine. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your kindness in helping me. If my men get anything connecting Lang with Mademoiselle Violette's case, I'll let you know immediately." It was a bright, clear, snappy morning, in contrast with the heat of the day before, when we boarded the revenue tug at the barge office. The waters of the harbour never looked more blue as they danced in the early sunlight, flecked here and there by a foaming whitecap as the conflicting tides eddied about. The shores of Staten Island were almost as green as in the spring, and even the haze over the Brooklyn factories had lifted. It looked almost like a stage scene, clear and sharp, new and brightly colored. Perhaps the least known and certainly one of the least recognized of the government services is that which includes the vigilant ships of the Revenue Service. It was not a revenue cutter, however, on which we were plowing down the bay. The cutter lay, white and gleaming in the morning sun, at anchor off Stapleton, like a miniature warship, saluting as we passed. The revenue boats which steam down to quarantine and make fast to the incoming ocean greyhounds are revenue tugs. Down the bay we puffed and buffeted for about 40 minutes before we arrived at the little speck of an island that is Quarantine. Long before we were there we sighted the great La Montaigne near the group of buildings on the island, where she had been waiting since early morning for the tide and the customs officials. The tug steamed alongside, and quickly up the high ladder swarmed the boarding officer and the deputy collectors. We followed Herndon straight to the main saloon, where the collectors began to receive the declarations which had been made out on blanks furnished to the passengers on the voyage over. They had had several days to write them out, the less excuse for omissions. Glancing at each hastily, the collector detached it from the slip with the number at the bottom and handed the number back, to be presented at the inspector's desk at the pier, where customs inspectors were assigned in turn.
"Number 140 is the one we want to watch," I heard Herndon whisper to Kennedy. "That tall, dark fellow over there." I followed his direction cautiously and saw a sparely built, striking-looking man who had just filed his declaration and was chatting vivaciously with a lady who was just about to file hers. She was a clinging-looking little thing with that sort of doll-like innocence that deceives nobody. "No, you don't have to swear to it," he said. "You used to do that, but now you simply sign your name and take a chance," he added, smiling and showing a row of perfect teeth. "Number 156, Herndon noted as the collector detached the stub and handed it to her. "That was Mademoiselle Gabrielle." The couple passed out to the deck, still chatting gaily. "In the old days, before they got to be so beastly particular," I heard him say, "I always used to get the courtesy of the port, an official expedite, but that is over now." The ship was now under way, her flag snapping by the brisk, coolish breeze that told of approaching autumn. We had passed up the lower bay and the Narrows, and the passengers were crowded forward to catch the first glimpse of the skyscrapers of New York. Up on the bay we ploughed, throwing the spray proudly as we went. Herndon employed the time in keeping a sharp watch on the tall, thin man. Incidentally, he sought out the wireless operator and from him learned that a code wireless message had been received for Pierre, apparently from his partner Lang. "There is no mention of anything dutiable in this declaration by 140 which corresponds with any of the goods mentioned in the first cable from Paris," a collector remarked unobtrusively to Herndon, "nor in 156 corresponding to the second cable." "I didn't suppose there would be," was his laconic reply. "That's our job, to find the stuff." At last La Montaigne was warped into the dock. The piles of first-class baggage on the ship were raucously deposited on the wharf, and slowly the passengers filed down the plank to meet the line of white-capped uniformed inspectors and plain-clothes appraisers. The comedy and tragedy of the customs inspection had begun. We were among the first to land. Herndon took up a position from which he could see without being seen. In the semi-light of the little windows in the enclosed sides of the pier, under the steel girders of the arched roof like a vast hall, there was a panorama of a huge mass of open luggage. At last, number 140 came down, alone, to the roped-off dock. He walked nonchalantly over to the little deputy surveyor's desk, and an inspector was quickly assigned to him. It was all done neatly in the regular course of business, apparently. He did not know that in the orderly rush the sharpest of Herndon's men had been picked out, much as a trick card player will force a card on his victim. Already the customs inspection was well along. One inspector had been assigned to about each 5 passengers, and the big piles of finery were being remorselessly tumbled out in shapeless heaps and exposed to the gaze of that part of the public which was not too much concerned over the same thing as to its own goods and chattels. Reticules and purses were being inspected, every trunk was presumed to have a false bottom, and things wrapped up in paper were viewed suspiciously and unrolled. Clothes were being shaken and pawed. There did not seem to be much opportunity for concealment. Herndon now had donned the regulation straw hat of the appraiser, and accompanied by us posing as visitors, was sauntering about. At last we came within earshot of the spot where the inspector was going through the effects of 140. Out of the corner of my eyes I could see that a dispute was in progress over some trifling matter. The man was cool and calm. "Call the appraiser," he said at last, with an air of a man standing on his rights. "I object to this frisking of passengers. Uncle Sam is little better than a pickpocket. Besides, I can wait here all day. My partner is waiting for me uptown." Herndon immediately took notice. But it was quite evidently, after all, only an altercation for the benefit of those who were watching. I am sure he knew he was being watched, but as the dispute proceeded he assumed the look of a man keenly amused. The matter, involving only a few dollars, was finally adjusted by his yielding gracefully and with an air of resignation. Still, Herndon did not go, and I am sure it annoyed him. Suddenly he turned and faced Herndon.
I could not help thinking, in spite of all that he must be so expert, that if he really were a smuggler, he had all the poise and skill at evasion that would entitle him to be called a past master of the art. "You see that woman over there?" he whispered. "She says she is just coming home after studying music in Paris." We looked. It was the guileless ingenue, Mademoiselle Gabrielle. "She has dutiable goods all right. I saw her declaration. She is trying to bring in as personal effects of a foreign resident gowns which, I believe, she intends to wear on the stage. She's an actress." There was nothing for Herndon to do but to act on the tip. The man had got rid of us temporarily, but we knew the inspector would be, if anything, more vigilant. I think he took even longer than usual. Mademoiselle Gabrielle and her maid pouted and fussed over the renewed examination which Herndon ordered. According to the inspector, everything was new and expensive. According to her, old, shabby, and cheap. She denied everything, raged and threatened, but when, instead of ordering the stamp passed to be placed on her half-dozen trunks and bags, which contained in reality only a few dutiable articles, Herndon threatened to order them to the appraiser's stores and herself to go to the law division if she did not admit the points in dispute. There was a real scene. "Generally, madame," he remonstrated, though I could see he was baffled at finding nothing of the goods he had really expected to find. "Generally, even for a first offence, the goods are confiscated, and the court or district attorney is content to let the person off with a fine. If this happens again, we'll be more severe. So you had better pay the duty on these few little matters without that." If he had been expecting to throw a scare into her, it did not succeed. "Well, I suppose if I must, I must," she said, and the only result of the diversion was that she paid a few dollars more than had been expected and went off in a high state of mind. Herndon had disappeared for a moment, after a whisper from Kennedy, to instruct two of his men to shadow Mademoiselle Gabrielle and later Pierre. He soon rejoined us, and we casually returned to the vicinity of our tall friend, number 140, for whom I even felt less respect than ever after his apparently ungallant action toward the lady he had been talking with. He seemed to notice my attitude, and he remarked defensively for my benefit, "Only a patriotic act." His inspector by this time had finished a most minute examination. There was nothing that could be discovered, not a false book with a secret spring that might disclose instead of reading matter a heap of almost priceless jewels, not a suspicious bulging of any garment or of the lining of a trunk or grip. Some of the goods might have been on his person, but not much, and certainly there was no excuse for ordering a personal examination, for he could not have hidden a tenth part of what we knew he had, even under the proverbial porous plaster. He was impeccable. Accordingly, there was nothing for the inspector to do but to declare a polite armistice. "So you did not find Mona Lisa in a false bottom, and my trunks were not lined with smuggled cigars after all," he rasped savagely as the stamp passed was at last affixed and he paid in cash at the little window with its sign, "Pay duty here, U.S. Customs House." Some $100 instead of the thousands Herndon had been hoping to collect, if not to seize. All through the inspection, an extra close scrutiny had been kept on the other passengers as well, to prevent any of them from being in league with the smugglers, though there was no direct or indirect evidence to show that any of the others were. We were about to leave the wharf, also, when Craig's attention was called to a stack of trunks still remaining. "Whose are those?" he asked as he lifted one. It felt suspiciously light. "Some of them belong to a Mr. Pierre and the rest to a Miss Gabrielle," answered an inspector, "bonded for Troy and waiting to be transferred by the express company." Here perhaps at last was an explanation, and Craig took advantage of it. Could it be that the real seat of trouble was not here but at some other place, that some exchange was to be made en route, or perhaps an attempt at bribery? Herndon, too, was willing to run a risk. He ordered the trunks opened immediately, but, to our disappointment, they were almost empty. There was scarcely a thing of value in them. Most of the contents consisted of clothes that had plainly been made in America and were being brought back here. It was another false scent. We had been played with and baffled at every turn. Perhaps this had been the method originally agreed on. At any rate, it had been changed. "Could they have left the goods in Paris after all?" I queried. "With the fall and winter trade just coming on," Kennedy replied, with an air of finality that set at rest any doubts about his opinion on that score. "I thought perhaps we had a case of what do you call it, Herndon, when they leave trunks that are to be secretly removed by dishonest expressmen from the wharf at night?" "Sleepers. Oh, we've broken that up too. No expressman would dare try it now. I must confess this thing is beyond me, Craig." Kennedy made no answer. Evidently, there was nothing to do but to await developments and see what Herndon's men reported. We had been beaten at every turn in the game. Herndon seemed to feel that there was a bitter sting in the defeat, particularly because the smuggler or smugglers had actually been in our grasp so long to do with as we pleased, and had so cleverly slipped out again, leaving us holding the bag. Kennedy was especially thoughtful as he told over the facts of the case in his mind. "Of course," he remarked, "Mademoiselle Gabrielle wasn't an actress, but we can't deny that she had very little that would justify Herndon in holding her, unless he simply wants a newspaper row." "But I thought Pierre was quite intimate with her at first," I ventured. "That was a dirty trick of his." Craig laughed. "You mean an old one. That was simply a blind to divert attention from himself. I suspect they talked that over between themselves for days before." It was plainly more perplexing than ever. What had happened? Had Pierre been a prestidigitator, and had he merely said presto when our backs were turned and whisked the goods invisibly into the country? I could find no explanation for the little drama on the pier. If Herndon's men had any genius in detecting smuggling, their professional opponents certainly had greater genius in perpetrating it. We did not see Herndon again until after a hasty luncheon. He was in his office and inclined to take a pessimistic view of the whole affair. He brightened up when a telephone message came in from one of his shadows. The men trailing Pierre and Mademoiselle Gabrielle had crossed trails and run together at a little French restaurant on the lower west side, where Pierre, Lang, and Mademoiselle Gabrielle had met, and were dining in a most friendly spirit. Kennedy was right. She had merely been a cog in the machinery of the plot. The man reported that even when a newsboy had been sent in by him with the afternoon papers, displaying in big headlines the mystery of the death of Mademoiselle Violette, they had paid no attention. It seemed evident that, whatever the fate of the little modiste, Mademoiselle Gabrielle had quite replaced her in the affections of Pierre. There was nothing for us to do but to separate and await developments. It was late in the afternoon when Craig and I received a hurried message from Herndon. One of his men had just called him up over long distance from Riverledge. The party had left the restaurant hurriedly, and though they had taken the only taxicab in sight, he had been able to follow them in time to find out that they were going up to Riverledge. They were now preparing to go out for a sail in one of Lang's motorboats, and he would be unable, of course, to follow them further. For the remainder of the afternoon Kennedy remained pondering the case. At last an idea seemed to dawn on him. He found Herndon still in his office and made an appointment to meet on the waterfront near La Montaigne's pier after dinner. The change in Kennedy's spirits was obvious, though it did not in the least enlighten my curiosity. Even after a dinner which was lengthened out considerably, I thought I did not get appreciably nearer a solution, for we strolled over to the laboratory, where Craig loaded me down with a huge package which was wrapped up in heavy paper. We arrived on the corner opposite the wharf just as it was growing dusk. The neighborhood did not appeal to me at night, and even though there were two of us, I was rather glad when we met Herndon, who was waiting in the shadow of a fruit stall. But instead of proceeding across to the pier by the side of which La Montaigne was moored, we cut across the wide street and turned down the next pier, where a couple of freighters were lying. The odor of salt water, sewage, rotting wood, and the night air was not inspiring. Nevertheless, I was now carried away with the strangeness of our adventure. Halfway down the pier, Kennedy paused before one of the gangways that was shrouded in darkness. The door was opened, and we followed gingerly across the dirty deck of the freight ship. Below, we could hear the water lapping the piles of the pier. Across a dark abyss lay the grim monster La Montagne, with here and there a light gleaming on one of her decks. The sounds of the city seemed miles away. "What a fine place for a murder," laughed Kennedy coolly. He was unwrapping the package which he had taken from me. It proved to be a huge reflector, in front of which was placed a little arrangement which, under the light of a shaded lantern carried by Herndon, looked like a coil of wire of some kind. To the back of the reflector Craig attached two other flexible wires, which led to a couple of dry cells and a cylinder with a broadened end, made of vulcanized rubber. It might have been a telephone receiver, for all I could tell in the darkness. While I was still speculating on the possible use of the enormous parabolic reflector, a slight commotion on the opposite side of the pier distracted my attention. A ship was coming in and was being carefully and quietly berthed alongside the other big iron freighter on that side. Herndon had left us. "The Mohican is here," he remarked as he rejoined us. To my look of inquiry he added, "The revenue cutter." Kennedy had now finished and pointed the reflector full at La Montagne. With a whispered, hasty word of caution and advice to Herndon, he drew me along with him down the wharf again. At the little door which was cut in the barrier guarding the shore end of La Montagne's wharf, Kennedy stopped. The Customs Service night watchman — there is always a watchman of some kind aboard every ship, passenger or freighter, all the time she is in port — seemed to understand, for he admitted us after a word with Kennedy. Threading our way carefully among the boxes and bales and crates which were piled high, we proceeded down the wharf. Under the electric lights the longshoremen were working feverishly, for the unloading and loading of a giant transatlantic vessel in the rush season is a long and tedious process at best, requiring night work and overtime, for every moment, like every cubic foot of space, counts. Once within the door, however, no one paid much attention to us. They seemed to take it for granted that we had some right there. We boarded the ship by one of the many entrances and then proceeded down to a deck where apparently no one was working. It was more like a great house than a ship, I felt, and I wondered whether Kennedy's search was not more of a hunt for a needle in a haystack than anything else. Yet he seemed to know what he was after. We had descended to what I imagined must be the quarters of the steward. About us were many large cases and chests, stacked up and marked as belonging to the ship. Kennedy's attention was attracted to them immediately. All at once it flashed on me what his purpose was. In some of those cases were the smuggled goods. Before I could say a word, and before Kennedy had a chance to even try to verify his suspicions, a sudden approach of footsteps startled us. He drew me into a cabin or room full of shelves with ship stores. "Why didn't you bring Herndon over and break into the boxes if you think his stuff is hidden in one of them?" I whispered. "And let those higher up escape while their tools take all the blame?" he answered. "Shh." The men who had come into the compartment looked about as if expecting to see someone. "Two of them came down," a gruff voice said. "Where are they?" From the noise I inferred that there must be 4 or 5 men, and from the ease with which they shifted the cases about some of them must have been pretty husky stevedores. "I don't know," a more polished but unfamiliar voice answered. The door to our hiding place was opened roughly and then banged shut before we could realize it. With a taunting laugh, someone turned a key in the lock, and before we could move, a quick shift of packing cases against the door made escape impossible. Here we were marooned, shanghaied as it were, within sight, if not call, of Herndon and our friends. We had run up against professional smugglers, of whom I had vaguely read, disguised as stewards, deckhands, stokers, and other workers. The only other opening to the cabin was a sort of porthole, more for ventilation than anything else. Kennedy stuck his head through it, but it was impossible for a man to squeeze out. There was one of the lower decks directly before us, while a bright arc light gleamed tantalizingly over it, throwing a round circle of light into our prison. I reflected bitterly on our shipwreck within sight of port. Kennedy remained silent, and I did not know what was working in his mind. Together we made out the outline of the freighter at the next wharf and speculated as to the location where we had left Herndon with the huge reflector. There was no moon, and it was as black as ink in that direction. But if we could have got out, I would have trusted to luck to reach it by swimming. Below us, from the restless water lapping on the sides of the hulk of La Montagne, we could hear now muffled sounds. It was a motorboat, which had come crawling up the riverfront with lights extinguished and had pushed a cautious nose into the slip where our ship lay at the quay. None of your romantic low-lying, rakish craft of the old smuggling yarns was this, ready for deeds of desperation in the dark hours of midnight. It was just a modern little motorboat, up to date and swift. "Perhaps we'll get out of this finally," I grumbled as I understood now what was afoot, but not in time to be of any use. A smothered sound as of something going over the vessel's side followed. It was one of the boxes which we had seen outside in the storeroom. Another followed, and a third and a fourth. Then came a subdued parley. "We have 2 customs detectives locked in a cabin here. We can't stay now. You'll have to take us and our things off too." "Can't do it," called up another muffled voice. "Make your things into a little bundle. We'll take that. But you'll have to get past the night watchman yourselves and meet us at Riverledge." A moment later something else went over the side, and from the sound we could infer that the engine of the motorboat was being started. A voice sounded mockingly outside our door. "Bonjour, you fellows in there. We're going up the dock. Sorry to leave you here till morning, but they'll let you out then. Au revoir." Before I could hear just the faintest well-muffled chug-chug, Kennedy, in the meantime, had been coolly craning his neck out of our porthole under the rays of the arc light overhead. He was holding something in his hand. It seemed like a little silver-backed piece of thin glass with a flaring funnel-like thing back of it, which he held most particularly. Though he heard the parting taunt outside, he paid no attention. "You go to the deuce, whoever you are," I cried, beating on the door, to which only a coarse laugh echoed back down the passageway. "Be quiet, Walter," ordered Kennedy. "We have located the smuggled goods in the storeroom of the steward, 4 wooden cases of them. I think the stuff must have been brought on the ship in the trunks and then transferred to the cases, perhaps after the code wireless message was received. But we have been overpowered and locked in a cabin with a port too small to crawl through. The cases have been lowered over the side of the ship to a motorboat that was waiting below. The lights on the boat are out, but if you hurry you can get it. The accomplices who locked us in are going to disappear up the wharf. If you could only get the night watchman quickly enough, you could catch them, too, before they reach the street." I had turned, half expecting to see Kennedy talking to a ship's officer who might have chanced on the deck outside. There was no one. The only thing of life was the still sputtering arc light. Had the man gone crazy? "What of it?" I growled. "Don't you suppose I know all that? What's the use of repeating it now? The thing to do is to get out of this hole. Come, help me at this door. Maybe we can batter it down." Kennedy paid no attention to me, however, but kept his eyes glued on the Cimmerian blackness outside the porthole. He had done nothing apparently, yet a long finger of light seemed to shoot out into the sky from the pier across from us and begin waving back and forth as it was lowered to the dark waters of the river. It was a searchlight. At once I thought of the huge reflector which I had seen set up, but that had been on our side of the next pier, and this light came from the far side where the Mohican lay. "What is it?" I asked eagerly. "What has happened?" It was as if a prayer had been answered from our dungeon on La Montagne. "I knew we should need some means to communicate with Herndon," he explained simply, "and the wireless telephone wasn't practicable. So I have used Dr. Alexander Graham Bell's photophone. Any of the lights on this side of La Montagne I knew would serve. What I did, Walter, was merely to talk into the mouthpiece back of this little silvered mirror which reflects light. The vibrations of the voice caused the diaphragm in it to vibrate, and thus the beam of reflected light was made to pulsate. In other words, this little thing is just a simple apparatus to transform the air vibrations of the voice into light vibrations. The parabolic reflector over there catches these light vibrations and focuses them on the cell of selenium which you perhaps noticed in the center of the reflector.
You remember doubtless that the element selenium varies its electrical resistance under light. Thus, there are reproduced similar variations in the cell to those vibrations here in this transmitter. The cell is connected with a telephone receiver and batteries over there, and there you are. It is very simple. In the ordinary carbon telephone transmitter, a variable electrical resistance is produced by pressure, since carbon is not so good a conductor under pressure. Then these variations are transmitted along two wires. This photophone is wireless. Selenium even emits notes under a vibratory beam of light, the pitch depending on the frequency. Changes in the intensity of the light focused by the reflector on the cell alter its electrical resistance and vary the current from the dry batteries. Hence the telephone receiver over there is affected. Bell used a photophone or radiophone over several hundred feet. Rumor over several miles. When you thought I was talking to myself, I was really telling Herndon what had happened and what to do, talking to him literally over a beam of light. I could scarcely believe it, but an exclamation from Kennedy as he drew his head in quickly recalled my attention. "Look out on the river, Walter," he cried. "The Mohican has a searchlight sweeping up and down. What do you see?" The long finger of light had now come to rest. In its pathway I saw a lightless motorboat bobbing up and down, crowding on all speed, yet followed relentlessly by the accusing finger. The riverfront was now alive with shouting. Suddenly the Mohican shot out from behind the pier where she had been hidden. In spite of Lang's expertness, it was an unequal race. Nor would it have made much difference if it had been otherwise, for a shot rang out from the Mohican which commanded instant respect. A powerful revenue cutter rapidly overhauled the little craft. A hurried tread down the passageway followed. Cases were being shoved aside, and a key in the door of our compartment turned quickly. I waited with clenched fists, prepared for an attack. "You're all right?" Herndon's voice inquired anxiously. "We've got that steward, and the other fellow's all right." "Yes, come on," shouted Craig. "The cutter has made a capture." We had reached the stern of the ship, and far out in the river Mohican was now headed toward us. She came alongside, and Herndon quickly seized a rope, fastened it to the rail, and let himself down to the deck of the cutter. Kennedy and I followed. "This is a high-handed proceeding," I heard a voice that must have been Lang's protesting. "By what right do you stop me? You shall suffer for this." "The Mohican," broke in Herndon, "has the right to appear anywhere from South Shoal Lightship off Nantucket to the Capes of the Delaware, demand an inspection of any vessel's manifest and papers, board anything from La Montaigne to your little motorboat, inspect it, seize it if necessary, put a crew on it." He slapped the little cannon. "That commands respect. Besides, you are violating the regulations. No lights." On the deck of the cutter now lay 4 cases. A man broke one of them open, then another. Inside he disclosed thousands of dollars worth of finery, while from a tray he drew several large camise bags of glittering diamonds and pearls. Pierre looked on, crushed, all his jauntiness gone. "So," exclaimed Kennedy, facing him, "you have your jilted fiancée, Mademoiselle Violette, to thank for this. Her letters and her suicide. It wasn't as easy as you thought to throw her over for a new soulmate, this Mademoiselle Gabrielle, whom you were going to set up as a rival in business to Violette. Violette has her revenge for making a plaything of her heart, and if the dead can take any satisfaction, she—" With a quick movement, Kennedy anticipated a motion of Pierre's. The ruined smuggler had contemplated either an attack on himself or his captor, but Craig had seized him by the wrist and ground his knuckles into the back of Pierre's clenched fist until he winced with pain. An Apache dagger similar to that which the little modiste had used to end her life tragedy cluttered to the deck of the ship, a mute testimonial to the high class of society Pierre and his associates must have cultivated. "None of that, Pierre," Craig muttered, releasing him. "You can't cheat the government out of its just dues, even in the matter of punishment." End of The Smuggler. Recording by Elliott Miller. www.voiceofe.com.
Chapter 11 of The Poisoned Pen by Arthur B. Reeve. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elliott Miller. The Invisible Ray.
I won't deny that I had some expectations from the old man myself.
Kennedy's client was speaking in a low, full-chested, vibrating voice, with some emotion, so low that I had entered the room without being aware that anyone was there until it was too late to retreat.
As his physician for over 12 years, the man pursued, I certainly had been led to hope to be remembered in his will, but, Professor Kennedy, I can't put it too strongly when I say that there is no selfish motive in my coming to you about the case. There's something wrong. Depend on that.
Craig had glanced up at me, and as I hesitated, I could see in an instant that the speaker was a practitioner of a type that is rapidly passing away, the old-fashioned family doctor.
Dr. Benham, I should like to have you know Mr. Jameson, introduced Craig. You can talk as freely before him as you have to me alone. We always work together.
I shook hands with the visitor.
The doctor has succeeded in interesting me greatly in a case which has some unique features, Kennedy explained. It has to do with Stephen Haswell, the eccentric old millionaire of Brooklyn. Have you ever heard of him?
Yes, indeed, I replied, recalling an occasional article which had appeared in the newspapers regarding a dusty and dirty old house in that part of the Heights in Brooklyn, whence all that is fashionable had not yet taken flight, a house of mystery, yet not more mysterious than its owner in his secretive comings and goings in the affairs of men of a generation beyond his time. Further than the facts that he was reputed to be very wealthy and led, in the heart of a great city, what was nearly like the life of a hermit as possible, I knew little or nothing. "What has he been doing now?" I asked.
About a week ago, repeated the doctor, in answer to a nod of encouragement from Kennedy, I was summoned in the middle of the night to attend Mr. Haswell, who, as I have been telling Professor Kennedy, had been a patient of mine for over 12 years. He had been suddenly stricken with total blindness. Since then he appears to be failing fast. That is, he appeared so the last time I saw him, a few days ago, after I had been superseded by a younger man. It is a curious case, and I have thought about it a great deal. But I didn't like to speak to the authorities. There wasn't enough to warrant that, and I should have been laughed out of court for my pains. The more I have thought about it, however, the more I have felt it my duty to say something to somebody, and so, having heard of Professor Kennedy, I decided to consult him. The fact of the matter is, I very much fear that there are circumstances which will bear sharp looking into, perhaps a scheme to get control of the old man's fortune." The doctor paused, and Craig inclined his head, as much to signify his appreciation of the delicate position in which Burnham stood in the case. Before the doctor could proceed further, Kennedy handed me a letter which had been lying before him on the table. It had evidently been torn into small pieces and then carefully pasted together. The superscription gave a small town in Ohio and a date about a fortnight previous. "Dear Father," it read, "I hope you will pardon me for writing, but I cannot let the occasion of your 75th birthday pass without a word of affection and congratulation. I am alive and well. Time has dealt leniently with me in that respect, if not in money matters. I do not say this in the hope of reconciling you to me. I know that is impossible after all these cruel years, but I do wish that I could see you again. Remember, I am your only child, and even if you still think I have been a foolish one, please let me come to see you once before it is too late. We are constantly traveling from place to place, but shall be here for a few days. Your loving daughter, Grace Haswell Martin." "Some 14 or 15 years ago," explained the doctor as I looked up from reading the note, "Mr. Haswell's only daughter eloped with an artist named Martin. He had been engaged to paint a portrait of the late Mrs. Haswell from a photograph. It was the first time that Grace Haswell had ever been able to find expression for the artistic yearning which had always been repressed by the cold, practical sense of her father. She remembered her mother perfectly since the sad bereavement of her girlhood, and naturally she watched and helped the artist eagerly. The result was a portrait which might well have been painted from the subject herself, rather than from a cold photograph. Haswell saw the growing intimacy of his daughter and the artist, His bent of mind was solely toward money and material things, and he had once conceived a bitter and unreasoning hatred for Martin, who, he believed, had schemed to capture his daughter and an easy living. Art was as foreign to his nature as possible. Nevertheless, they went ahead and married, and, well, it resulted in the old man disinheriting the girl. The young couple disappeared bravely to make their way by their chosen profession, and, as far as I know, have never been heard from since until now. Haswell made a new will, and I have always understood that practically all of his fortune is to be devoted to founding the technology department in a projected university of Brooklyn.
You have never seen Mrs. Martin or her husband? Asked Kennedy.
No, never, but in some way she must have learned that I had some influence with her father, for she wrote to me not long ago, enclosing a note for him and asking me to intercede for her. I did so. I took the letter to him as diplomatically as I could. The old man flew into a towering rage, refused even to look at the letter, tore it up into bits, and ordered me never to mention the subject to him again. That is her note, which I saved. However, it is the sequel about which I wish your help. The physician folded up the patched letter carefully before he continued. Mr. Haswell, as you perhaps know, has for many years been a prominent figure in various curious speculations, or rather in loaning money to many curious spectators. It is not necessary to go into the different schemes which he has helped to finance. Even though most of them have been unknown to the public, they have certainly given him such a reputation that he is much sought after by investors. Not long ago, Haswell became interested in the work of an obscure chemist over in Brooklyn, Morgan Prescott. Prescott claims, as I understand, to be able to transmute copper into gold. Whatever you think of it offhand, you should visit his laboratory yourselves, gentlemen. I am told it is wonderful, though I have never seen it and can't explain it. I have met Prescott several times while he was trying to persuade Mr. Haswell to back him in his scheme, but he was never disposed to talk to me, for I had no money to invest. So far as I know about it, the thing sounds scientific and plausible enough. I leave you to judge of that. It is only an incident in my story, and I will pass over it quickly. Prescott, then, believes that the elements are merely progressive variations of an original substance or base called protyle, from which everything is derived. But this fellow Prescott goes much further than any of the former theorists. He does not stop with matter. He believes that he has the secret of life also, that he can make the transition from the inorganic to the organic, from inert matter to living protoplasm, and thence from living protoplasm to mind and what we call soul, whatever that may be.
And here is where the weird and uncanny part of it comes in, commented Craig,
turning from the doctor to me to call my attention particularly to what was about to follow. Having arrived at the point where he asserts that he can create and destroy matter, life, and mind, continued the doctor, as if himself fascinated by the idea, Prescott very naturally does not have to go far before he also claims a control over telepathy and even a communication with the dead. He even calls the messages which he receives by a word which he has coined himself, teleparograms. Thus he says he has unified the physical, the physiological, and the psychical, a system of absolute scientific monism. The doctor paused again, then resumed. One afternoon, about a week ago, apparently, as far as I am able to piece together the story, Prescott was demonstrating his marvelous discovery of the unity of nature. Suddenly he faced Mr. Haswell. "Shall I tell you a fact, sir, about yourself?" he asked quickly. "The truth as I see it by means of my wonderful invention? If it is the truth, will you believe in me? Will you put money into my invention? Will you share in becoming fabulously rich?" Haswell made some non-committal answer, but Prescott seemed to look into the machine through a very thick plate glass window, with Haswell placed directly before it. He gave a cry. "Mr. Haswell," he exclaimed, "I regret to tell you what I see. You have disinherited your daughter. She has passed out of your life, and at the present moment you do not know where she is." "That's true," replied the old man bitterly, "and more than that I don't care. Is that all you see? That's nothing new.
No, unfortunately, that is not all I see. Can you bear something further? I think you ought to know it. I have here a most mysterious telepagram.
Yes, what is it? Is she dead?
No, it is not about her. It is about yourself. Tonight, at midnight, or perhaps a little later, repeated Prescott solemnly, you will lose your sight as a punishment for your action.
Oh, exclaimed the old man in a dudgeon. If that is all your invention can tell me, goodbye. You told me you were able to make gold. Instead, you make foolish prophecies. I'll put no money into such tomfoolery. I'm a practical man. And with that he stamped out of the laboratory. Well, that night, about 1 o'clock, in the silence of the lonely old house, the aged caretaker Jane, whom he had hired after he banished his daughter from his life, heard a wild shout of "Help! Help!" Haswell, alone in his room on the second floor, was groping about in the dark.
"Jane," he ordered, "a light, a light."
"I have lighted the gas, Mr. Haswell," she cried. A groan followed. He had himself found a match, had struck it, had even burnt his fingers with it, yet he saw nothing. The blow had fallen, at almost the very hour which Prescott, by means of his weird telepagram, had predicted. Old Haswell was stricken. "I'm blind," he gasped. "Send for Dr. Burnham." I went to him immediately when the maid roused me, but there was nothing I could do, except prescribe perfect rest for his eyes and keeping in a dark room in the hopes that his sight might be restored as suddenly and miraculously as it had been taken away. The next morning, with his own hand, trembling and scrawling in his blindness, he wrote the following on a piece of paper. Mrs. Grace Martin. Information wanted about the present whereabouts of Mrs. Grace Martin, formerly Grace Haswell, of Brooklyn. Stephen Haswell, Pierrepont Street, Brooklyn. This advertisement he caused to be placed in all the New York papers and to be wired to the leading Western papers. Haswell himself was a changed man after his experience. He spoke bitterly of Prescott, yet his attitude toward his daughter was completely reversed. Whether he admitted to himself a belief in the prediction of the inventor I do not know. Certainly he scouted such an idea in telling me about it. A day or two after the advertisements appeared, a telegram came to the old man from a little town in Indiana. It read simply, "Dear Father, am starting for Brooklyn today. Grace." The upshot was that Grace Haswell, or rather Grace Martin, appeared the next day, forgave and was forgiven with much weeping, although the old man still refused resolutely to be reconciled with and receive her husband. Mrs. Martin started in to clean up the old house. A vacuum cleaner sucked a ton or two of dust from it. Everything was changed. Jane grumbled a great deal, but there was no doubt a great improvement. Meals were served regularly. The old man was taken care of as never before. Nothing was too good for him. Everywhere the touch of a woman was evident in the house. The change was complete. It even extended to me. Some friend had told her of an eye and ear specialist, a Dr. Scott, who was engaged. Since then, I understand, a new will has been made, much to the chagrin of the trustees of the projected school. Of course I am cut out of the new will, and that with the knowledge at least of the woman who once appealed to me. But it does not influence me in coming to you.
"But what has happened since to arouse suspicion?" asked Kennedy, watching the doctor furtively.
"Why, the fact is that, in spite of all this added care, the old man is failing more rapidly than ever. He never goes out except attended, and not much even then. The other day I happened to meet Jane on the street. The faithful old soul poured forth a long story about his growing dependence on others, and ended by mentioning a curious red discoloration that seems to have broken out over his face and hands. More from the way she said it than from what she said, I gained the impression that something was going on which should be looked into." "Then you perhaps think that Prescott and Mrs. Martin are in some way connected in this case?" I hazarded. I had scarcely framed the question before he replied in an emphatic negative. On the contrary, it seems to me that if they know each other at all, it is with hostility, with the exception of the first stroke of blindness. Here he lowered his voice earnestly. Practically every misfortune that has overtaken Mr. Haswell has been since the advent of this new Dr. Scott. I do not wish even to breathe that Mrs. Martin has done anything except what a daughter should do. I think she has shown herself a model of forgiveness and devotion. Nevertheless, the turn of events under the new treatment has been so strange that it almost makes one believe that there might be something occult about it, or wrong with the new doctor.
"Would it be possible, do you think, for us to see Mr. Haswell?"
asked Kennedy, when Dr. Burnham had come to a full stop after pouring forth his suspicions.
"I should like to see this Dr. Scott, but first I should like to get into the old house without exciting hostility."
The doctor was thoughtful. "You'll have to arrange that yourself," he answered. "Can't you think up a scheme? For instance, go to him with a proposal like the old schemes he used to finance. He is very much interested in electrical inventions. He made his money by speculation in telegraphs and telephones in the early days when they were more or less dreams. I should think a wireless system of television might at least interest him and furnish an excuse for getting in, although I am told his daughter discourages all tangible investment in the schemes that used to interest his active mind."
"An excellent idea," exclaimed Kennedy. "It is worth trying, anyway. It is still early. Suppose we ride over to Brooklyn with you. You can direct us to the house and we'll try to see him."
It was still light when we mounted the high steps of the house of mystery across the bridge. Mrs. Martin, who met us in the parlor, proved to be a stunning-looking woman with brown hair and beautiful dark eyes. As far as we could see, the old house plainly showed the change. The furniture and ornaments were of a period long past, but everything was scrupulously neat. Hanging over the old marble mantel was a painting which quite evidently was that of the long since deceased Mrs. Haswell, the mother of Grace. In spite of the hideous style of dress of the period after the war, she had evidently been a very beautiful woman with large masses of light chestnut hair and blue eyes which the painter had succeeded in catching with almost life-likeness for a portrait. It took only a few minutes for Kennedy, in his most engaging and plausible manner, to state the hypothetical reason of our call. Though it was perfectly self-evident from the start that Mrs. Martin would throw cold water on anything requiring an outlay of money, Craig accomplished his full purpose of securing an interview with Mr. Haswell. The invalid lay propped up in bed, and as we entered he heard us and turned his sightless eyes in our direction, almost as if he saw. Kennedy had hardly begun to repeat and elaborate the story which he had already told regarding his mythical friend who had at last a commercial wireless teleview, as he called it on the spur of the moment, when Jane, the aged caretaker, announced Dr. Scott. The new doctor was a youthfully dressed man, clean-shaven, but with an undefinable air of being much older than his smooth face led one to suppose. As he had a large practice, he said, he would beg our pardon for interrupting, but would not take long. It needed no great powers of observation to see that the old man placed great reliance on his new doctor, and that the visit partook of a social as well as a professional nature. Although they talked low, we could catch now and then a word or phrase. Dr. Scott bent down and examined the eyes of his patient casually. It was difficult to believe that they saw nothing, so bright was the blue of the iris. "Perfect rest for the present," the doctor directed, talking more to Mrs. Martin than to the old man. "Perfect rest, and then when his health is good, we shall see what can be done with that cataract." He was about to leave when the old man reached up and restrained him, taking hold of the doctor's wrist tightly, as if to pull him nearer in order to whisper to him without being overheard. Kennedy was sitting in a chair near the head of the bed, some feet away. As the doctor leaned down, Haswell, still holding his wrist, pulled him closer. I could not hear what was said, though somehow I had an impression that they were talking about Prescott, for it would not have been at all strange if the old man had been greatly impressed by the alchemist. Kennedy, I noticed, had pulled an old envelope from his pocket and was apparently engaged in jotting down some notes, glancing now and then from his writing to the doctor and then to Mr. Haswell. The doctor stood erect in a few moments and rubbed his wrist thoughtfully with the other hand, as if it hurt. At the same time he smiled on Mrs. Martin. "Your father has a good deal of strength yet, Mrs. Martin," he remarked. "He has a wonderful constitution. I feel sure that we can pull him out of this and that he has many, many years to live." Mr. Haswell, who caught the words eagerly, brightened visibly, and the doctor passed out. Kennedy resumed his description of the supposed wireless picture apparatus which was to revolutionize the newspaper, the theatre, and daily life in general. The old man did not seem enthusiastic and turned to his daughter with some remark. "Just at present," commented the daughter with an air of finality, "the only thing my father is much interested in is a way in which to recover his sight without an operation. He has just had a rather unpleasant experience with one inventor. I think it will be some time before he cares to embark in any other such schemes." Kennedy and I excused ourselves with appropriate remarks of disappointment. From his preoccupied manner it was impossible for me to guess whether Craig had accomplished his purpose or not. "Let us drop in on Dr. Burnham since we are over here," he said when we had reached the street. "I have some questions to ask him." The former physician of Mr. Haswell lived not very far from the house we had just left. He appeared a little surprised to see us so soon, but very interested in what had taken place. "Who is this Dr. Scott?" asked Craig when we were seated in the comfortable leather chairs of the old-fashioned consulting room. "Really, I know no more about him than you do," replied Burnham. I thought I detected a little of professional jealousy in his tone, though he went on frankly enough. "I have made inquiries and can find out nothing, except that he is supposed to be a graduate of some Western medical school, and came to this city only a short time ago. He has hired a small office in a new building devoted entirely to doctors, and they tell me that he is an eye and ear specialist, though I cannot see that he has any practice. Beyond that, I know nothing about him." "Your friend Prescott interests me, too," remarked Kennedy, changing the subject quickly. "Oh, he is no friend of mine," returned the doctor, fumbling in a drawer of his desk. "But I think I have one of his cards here which he gave me when we were introduced some time ago at Mr. Haswell's. I should think it would be worth while to see him, although he has no use for me because I have neither money nor influence. Still, you might take this card. Tell him you are from the university, that I have interested you in him, and that you know a trustee with money to invest. Anything you like that is plausible. When are you going to see him?" "The first thing in the morning," replied Kennedy. "After I have seen him, I shall drop in for another chat with you. Will you be here?" The doctor promised, and we took our departure. Prescott's laboratory, which we found the next day from the address on the card, proved to be situated in one of the streets near the waterfront under the bridge approach, where the factories and warehouses clustered thickly. It was a great deal of anticipation of seeing something happen that we threaded our way through the maze of streets with the cobweb structure of the bridge carrying its endless succession of cars arcing high over our heads. We had nearly reached the place when Kennedy paused and pulled out two pairs of glasses, those huge, round, tortoiseshell affairs. "You needn't mind these, Walter," he explained. "They are only plain glass, that is, not ground. You can see through them as well as through air. We must be careful not to excite suspicion. Perhaps a disguise might have been better, but I think this will do. They at least add a decade to your age. If you could see yourself, you would speak to your reflection. You look as scholarly as a Chinese mandarin. Remember, let me do the talking, and do just as I do." We had now entered the shop, stumbled up the dark stairs, and presented Dr. Burnham's card with a word of explanation along the lines which he had suggested. Prescott, surrounded by his retorts, crucibles, barrettes, and condensers, received us much more graciously than I had any reason to anticipate. He was a man in the late 40s, his face covered with a thick beard, and his eyes, which seemed a little weak, were helped out with glasses almost as scholarly as ours. I could not help thinking that we three bespectacled figures lacked only the flowing robes to be taken for a group of medieval alchemists set down a few centuries out of our time in the murky light of Prescott's sanctum. Yet, though he accepted us at our face value and began to talk of his strange discoveries, there was none of the old familiar prating about matrix and flux, elixir, magisterium, magnum opus, the mastery and the quintessence, Those alternate names for the philosopher's stone which Paracelsus, Simon Forman, Jerome Cardan, and the other medieval worthies indulged in. This experience at least was as up-to-date as the Curies, Becquerel, Ramsay, and the rest. "Transmutation," remarked Prescott, "was, as you know, finally declared to be a scientific absurdity in the 18th century, but I may say that it is no longer so regarded. I do not ask you to believe anything until you have seen. All I ask is that you maintain the same open mind which the most progressive scientists of today exhibit in regards to the subject." Kennedy had seated himself some distance from a curious piece, or rather collection of apparatus, over which Prescott was working. It consisted of numerous coils and tubes. "It may seem strange to you, gentlemen," Prescott proceeded, "that a man who is able to produce gold from, say, copper, should be seeking capital from other people. My best answer to that old objection is that I am not seeking capital, as such. The situation with me is simply this. Twice I have applied to the patent office for a patent on my invention. They not only refuse to grant it, but they refuse to consider the application or even to give me a chance to demonstrate my process to them. On the other hand, suppose I try this thing secretly. How can I prevent anyone from learning my trade secret, leaving me and making gold on his own account? Men will desert as fast as I educate them. Think of the economic result of that. It would turn the world topsy-turvy. I am looking for someone who can be trusted to the last limit to join with me, furnish the influence and standing while I furnish the brains and the invention. Either we must get the government interested and sell the invention to it, or we must get government protection and special legislation. I am not seeking capital. I am seeking protection. First, let me show you something." He turned a switch, and a part of the collection of apparatus began to vibrate. "You are undoubtedly acquainted with the modern theories of matter," he began, plunging into the explanation of his process. "Starting with the atom, we believe no longer that it is indivisible. Atoms are composed of thousands of ions, as they are called, really little electric charges. Again, you know that we have found that all the elements fall into groups. Each group has certain related atomic weights and properties which can be and have been predicted in advance of the discovery of missing elements in the group. I started with the reasonable assumption that the atom of one element in a group could be modified so as to become the atom of another element in the group, that one group could perhaps be transformed into another, and so on. If only I knew the force that would change the number or modify the vibrations of these ions composing the various atoms. Now for years I have been seeking that force or combination of forces that would enable me to produce this change in the elements, raising or lowering them in the scale, so to speak. I have found it. I am not going to tell you or any other man whom you may interest the secret of how it was done until I find someone I can trust as I trust myself. But I am none the less willing that you should see the results. If they are not convincing, then nothing can be." He appeared to be debating whether to explain further, and finally resumed. "Matter thus being in reality a manifestation of force or ether in motion, it is necessary to change and control that force in motion. This assemblage of machines here is for that purpose. Now, a few words as to my theory." He took a pencil and struck a sharp blow on the table. "There, you have a single blow," he said. "Just one isolated noise. Now, if I strike this tuning fork, you have a vibrating note. In other words, a succession of blows or wave vibrations of a certain kind affects the ear and we call it sound, just as a succession of other wave vibrations affects the retina and we have sight. If a moving picture moves slower than a certain number of pictures a minute, you see the separate pictures. Faster, it is one moving picture. Now, as we increase the rapidity of wave vibration and decrease the wavelength, we pass from sound waves to heat waves, or what is known as the infrared waves, those which lie below the red in the spectrum of light. Next we come to light, which is composed of the 7 colors as you know from seeing them resolved in a prism. After that what are known as the ultraviolet rays, which lie beyond the violet of white light. We also have electric waves, the waves of the alternating current, and shorter still we find the Hertzian waves, which are used in wireless. We have only begun to know of X-rays and the alpha, beta, and gamma rays from them, of radium, radioactivity, and finally of this new force which I have discovered and call protodyne, the original force. In short, we find in the universe matter, force, and ether. Matter is simply ether in motion, is composed of corpuscles, electrically charged ions or electrons, moving units of negative electricity about 1/1000th part of the hydrogen atom. Matter is made up of electricity and nothing but electricity. Let us see what that leads to. You are acquainted with Mendeleev's periodic table? He drew forth a huge chart on which all the 80 or so elements were arranged in 8 groups or octaves and 12 series. Selecting one, he placed his fingers on the letters AU, under which was written the number 197.2. I wondered what the mystic letters and figures meant. That, he explained, is the scientific name for the element gold, and the figure is its atomic weight. You will see, he added, pointing down the second vertical column on the chart, that gold belongs to the hydrogen group: hydrogen, lithium, sodium, potassium, copper, rubidium, silver, caesium, then 2 blank spaces for elements yet to be discovered to science, then gold, and finally another unknown element. Running his fingers along the 11th horizontal series, he continued. The gold series, not the group, reads gold, mercury, thallium, lead, bismuth, and other elements known only to myself. For the known elements, however, these groups and series are now perfectly recognized by all scientists. They are determined by the fixed weight of the atom, and there is a close approximation to regularity. This 12th series is interesting. So far only radium, thorium, and uranium are generally known. We know that the radioactive elements are constantly breaking down, and one often hears uranium, for instance, called the parent of radium. Radium also gives off an emanation, and among its products is helium, quite another element. Thus the transmutation of matter is well known within certain bounds to all scientists today, like yourself, Professor Kennedy. It has even been rumored, but never proved, that copper has been transformed into lithium, both members of the hydrogen gold group, you will observe. Copper to lithium is going backward, so to speak. It has remained for me to devise this protodyne apparatus by which I can reverse that process of decay and go forward in the table. So to put it, can change lithium into copper and copper into gold. I can create and destroy matter by protodyne. He had been fingering a switch as he spoke. Now he turned it on triumphantly. A curious snapping and crackling noise followed, becoming more rapid, and as it mounted in intensity I could smell a pungent odor of ozone which told of an electric discharge. On went the machine until we could feel heat radiating from it. Then came a piercing burst of greenish-blue light from a long tube which looked like a curious mercury vapor lamp. After a few minutes of this, Prescott took a small crucible of black lead. "Now we are ready to try it," he cried in great excitement. "Here I have a crucible containing some copper. Any substance in the group would do, even hydrogen if there was any way I could handle the gas. I place it in the machine, so. Now if you could watch inside you would see it change. It is now rubidium, now silver, now caesium. It is a hitherto unknown element which I have named after myself, presium. Now a second unknown element, codium. Aha, there we have the gold." He drew forth the crucible, and there glowed in it a little bead or globule of molten gold. "I could have taken lead or mercury, and by varying the process done the same thing with the gold series as well as the gold group," he said, regarding the globule with obvious pride. "And I can put this gold back and bring it out copper or hydrogen, or, better yet, can advance it instead and cause it to decay, and can get a radioactive element which I have named morganium, after my first name, Morgan Prescott. Morganium is a radioactive element next in the series to radium, and much more active. Come closer and examine the gold." Kennedy shook his head as if perfectly satisfied to accept the result. As for me, I knew not what to think. It was all so plausible, and there was the bead of gold, too, that I turned to Craig for enlightenment. Was he convinced? His face was inscrutable. But as I looked, I could see that Kennedy had been holding concealed in the palm of his hand a bit of what might be a mineral. From my position, I could see the bit of mineral glowing, but Prescott could not.
"Might I ask," interrupted Kennedy, "what that curious greenish or bluish light from the tube is composed of?"
Prescott eyed him keenly for an instant through his thick glasses. Craig had shifted his gaze from the bit of mineral in his own hand, but was not looking at the light. He seemed to be indifferently contemplating Prescott's hand as it rested on the switch.
"That, sir," replied Prescott slowly, "is an emanation due to this new force, protodyne, which I use. It is a manifestation of energy, sir, that I may run changes not only through the whole gamut of the elements, but is capable of transforming the ether itself into matter, matter into life, and life into mind. It is the outward sign of the unity of nature. The means by which you secure the curious teleparograms I have heard of?" inquired Kennedy eagerly.
Prescott looked at him sharply, and for a moment I thought his face seemed to change from a livid white to an apoplectic red, although it may have been only the play of the weird light. When he spoke, it was with no show of even suppressed surprise.
"Yes," he answered calmly, "I see that you have heard something of them. I had a curious case a few days ago. I had hoped to interest a certain capitalist of high standing in this city. I showed him just what I have showed you, and I think he was impressed by it. Then I thought to cinch the matter by a teleparogram, but for some reason or other I failed to consult the forces I control as to the wisdom of doing so. Had I should have known better, but I went ahead in self-confidence and enthusiasm. I told him of a long-banished daughter with whom, in his heart, he was really wishing to become reconciled but was too proud to say the word. He resented it. He started to stamp out of this room, but not before I had another teleparogram which told of a misfortune that was soon to overtake the old man himself. If he had given me a chance I might have saved him, at least have flashed a teleparogram to that daughter myself, but he gave me no chance. He was gone. I do not know precisely what happened after that, but in some way this man found his daughter, and today she is living with him. As for my hopes of getting assistance from him, I lost them from the moment when I made my initial mistake of telling him something distasteful. The daughter hates me and I hate her. I have learned that she never ceases advising the old man against all schemes for investment except those bearing moderate interest and readily realized on. Dr. Burnham, I see you know him, has been superseded by another doctor, I believe. Well, I am through with that incident. I must get assistance from other sources. The old man, I think, would have tricked me out of the fruits of my discovery anyhow. Perhaps I am fortunate. Who knows? A knock at the door cut him short. Prescott opened it and a messenger boy stood there. "Is Professor Kennedy here?" he inquired. Craig motioned to the boy, signed for the message, and tore it open. "It is from Dr. Burnham," he exclaimed, handing the message to me.
"Mr. Haswell is dead," I read. "Looks to me like asphyxiation by gas or some other poison. Come immediately to his house. Burnham."
"You will pardon me," broke in Craig to Prescott, who was regarding us without the slightest trace of emotion, "but Mr. Haswell, the old man to whom I know you referred, is dead, and Dr. Burnham wishes to see me immediately. It was only yesterday that I saw Mr. Haswell, and he seemed in pretty good health and spirits. Prescott, though there was no love lost between you and the old man, I would esteem it a great favour if you would accompany me to the house. You need not take any responsibility unless you desire." His words were courteous enough, but Craig spoke in a tone of quiet authority which Prescott found it impossible to deny. Kennedy had already started to telephone to his own laboratory, describing a certain suitcase to one of his students and giving his directions. It was only a moment later that we were panting up the sloping street that led from the river front. In the excitement, I scarcely noticed where we were going until we hurried up the steps to the Haswell house. The aged caretaker met us at the door. She was in tears. Upstairs in the front room where we had first met the old man, we found Dr. Burnham working frantically over him. It took only a minute to learn what had happened. The faithful Jane had noticed an odor of gas in the hall.
had traced it to Mr. Haswell's room, had found him unconscious, and instinctively, forgetting the new Dr. Scott, had rushed forth for Dr. Burnham. Near the bed stood Grace Martin, pale but anxiously watching the efforts of the doctor to resuscitate the blue-faced man who was stretched cold and motionless on the bed. Dr. Burnham paused in his efforts as we entered. "He is dead, all right," he whispered aside. "I have tried everything I know to bring him back, but he is beyond help." There was still a sickening odor of illuminating gas in the room, although the windows were now all open. Kennedy, with provoking calmness in the excitement, turned from and ignored Dr. Burnham. "Have you summoned Dr. Scott?" he asked Mrs. Martin.
"No," she replied, surprised. "Should I have done so?"
"Yes. Send James immediately. Mr. Prescott, will you kindly be seated for a few moments?" Taking off his coat, Kennedy advanced to the bed where the emaciated figure lay, cold and motionless. Craig knelt down at Mr. Haswell's head and took the inert arms, raising them up until they were extended straight. Then he brought them down, folded upward at the elbow at the side. Again and again he tried this Sylvester method of inducing respiration, but with no more result than Dr. Burnham had secured. He turned the body over on its face and tried the new Schaefer method. There seemed to be not a spark of life left.
"Dr. Scott is out," replied the maid breathlessly, "but they are trying to locate him from his office, and if they do they will send him around immediately."
A ring at the doorbell caused us to think that he had been found, but it proved to be the student to whom Kennedy had telephoned at his own laboratory. He was carrying a heavy suitcase and a small tank. Kennedy opened the suitcase hastily and disclosed a little motor, some long tubes of rubber fitting into the small rubber cap, forceps, and other paraphernalia. The student quickly attached one tube to the little tank, while Kennedy grasped the tongue of the dead man with the forceps, pulled it up off the soft palate, and fitted the rubber cap snugly over his mouth and nose. "This is the Draeger pulmotor," he explained as he worked, "devised to resuscitate persons who have died of electric shock, but actually found to be of more value in cases of asphyxiation. Start the motor." The pulmotor began to pump. One could see the dead man's chest rise as it was inflated with oxygen forced by the accordion bellows from the tank through one of the tubes into the lungs. Then it fell as the oxygen and the poisonous gas were slowly sucked out through the other tube. Again and again the process was repeated, about 10 times a minute. Dr. Burnham looked on in undisguised amazement. He had long since given up all hope. The man was dead, medically dead as was ever any gas victim at this stage on whom all the usual methods of resuscitation had been tried and had failed. Still, minute after minute, Kennedy worked faithfully on, trying to discover some spark of life and fan it into flame. At last, after what seemed to be a half hour of unremitting effort, when the oxygen had long since been exhausted and only fresh air was being pumped into the lungs and out of them, there was a first faint glimmer of life in the heart and a touch of colour in the cheeks. Haswell was coming to. Another half hour found him muttering and rambling weakly. The letter, he moaned, rolling his glazed eyes about. "Where is the letter? Send for Grace." The moan was so audible that it was startling. It was like a voice from the grave. What did it all mean? Mrs. Martin was at his side in a moment. Father, here I am. Grace, what do you want?" The old man moved restlessly, feverishly, and pressed his trembling hand to his forehead, as if trying to collect his thoughts. He was weak, but it was evident that he had been saved. The pulmotor had been stopped. Craig threw the cap to his student to be packed up, and as he did so he remarked quietly, "I could wish that Dr. Scott had been found. There are some matters here that might interest him." He paused and looked slowly from the rescued man lying dazed on the bed toward Mrs. Martin. It was quite apparent even to me that she did not share the desire to see Dr. Scott, at least not just then. She was flushed and trembling with emotion. Crossing the room hurriedly, she flung open the door into the hall. "I am sure," she cried, controlling herself with difficulty and catching at a straw, as it were, "that you gentlemen, even if you have saved my father, are no friends of either his or mine. You are merely come here in response to Dr. Burnham, and he came because Jane lost her head in the excitement and forgot that Dr. Scott is now our physician." "But Dr. Scott could not have been found in time, madame," interposed Dr. Burnham, with evident triumph. She ignored the remark and continued to hold the door open. "Now leave us," she implored. "You, Dr. Burnham, you, Mr. Prescott, you, Professor Kennedy, and your friend Mr. Jameson, whoever you may be." She was now cold and calm. In the bewildering change of events we had forgotten the wan figure on the bed still grasping for the breath of life. I could not help wondering at the woman's apparent lack of gratitude, and a thought flashed over my mind. Had the affair come to a contest between various parties fighting by fair means or foul for the old man's money? Scott and Mrs. Martin, perhaps, against Prescott and Dr. Burnham? No one moved. We seemed to be waiting on Kennedy. Prescott and Mrs. Martin were now glaring at each other implacably. The old man moved restlessly on the bed, and over my shoulder I could hear him gasp faintly, "Where's Grace? Send for Grace." Mrs. Martin paid no attention, seeming not to hear, but stood facing us imperiously as if waiting for us to obey her orders and leave the house. Burnham moved toward the door, but Prescott stood his ground with a peculiar air of defiance. Then he took my arm and started rather precipitately, I thought, to leave. "Come, come," said somebody behind us. "Enough of the dramatics." It was Kennedy, who had been bending down, listening to the muttering of the old man. "Look at those eyes of Mr. Haswell," he said. "What color are they?" We looked. They were blue. "Down in the parlor," continued Kennedy leisurely, "you will find a portrait of the long-deceased Mrs. Haswell. If you will examine that painting you will see that her eyes are also a peculiarly limpid blue. No couple with blue eyes ever had a black-eyed child. At least, if this is such a case, the Carnegie Institution investigators would be glad to hear of it, for it is contrary to all that they have discovered on the subject after years of study of eugenics. Dark-eyed couples may have light-eyed children, but the reverse never. What do you say to that, madame?" "You lie!" screamed the woman, rushing frantically past us. "I am his daughter. No interloper shall separate us. Father!" The old man moved feebly away from her. "Send for Dr. Scott again," she demanded. "See if he cannot be found. He must be found. You are all enemies, villains." She addressed Kennedy, but included the whole room in her denunciation. "Not all," broke in Kennedy remorselessly. "Yes, madame, send for Dr. Scott. Why is he not here?" Prescott, with one hand on my arm and the other on Dr. Burnham's, was moving toward the door. "One moment, Prescott," interrupted Kennedy, detaining him with a look. "There was something I was about to say when Dr. Burnham's urgent message prevented it. I did not take the trouble even to find out how you obtained that little globule of molten gold from the crucible of alleged copper. There are so many tricks by which the gold could have been salted and brought forth at the right moment that it was hardly worth while. Besides, I had satisfied myself that my first suspicions were correct. See that?" He held out the little piece of mineral I had already seen in his hand in the alchemist's laboratory. "That is a piece of willemite. It has the property of glowing or fluorescing under a certain kind of rays which are themselves invisible to the human eye. Prescott, your story of the transmutation of elements is very clever, but not more clever than your real story. Let us piece it together. I had already heard from Dr. Burnham how Mr. Haswell was induced by his desire for gain to visit you, and how you had most mysteriously predicted his blindness. Now, there is no such thing as telepathy, at least in this case. How then was I to explain it? What could cause such a catastrophe naturally? Why, only those rays invisible to the human eye, but which make this piece of willemite glow, the ultraviolet rays. Kennedy was speaking rapidly and was careful not to pause long enough to give Prescott an opportunity to interrupt him. "These ultraviolet rays," he continued, "are always present in an electric arc light, though not to a great degree, unless the carbons have metal cores. They extend for 2 octaves above the violet of the spectrum and are too short to affect the eye as light, though they affect photographic plates. They are the friend of man when he uses them in moderation, as Finsen did in the famous blue light treatment, but they tolerate no familiarity. To let them, particularly the shorter of the rays, enter the eye is to invite trouble. There is no warning sense of discomfort, but from 6 to 18 hours after exposure to them, the victim experiences violent pains in the eyes and headache. Sight may be seriously impaired, and it may take years to recover. Often prolonged exposure results in blindness, though a moderate exposure acts like a tonic. The rays may have been compared in this double effect to drugs, such as strychnine. Too much of them may be destructive even to life itself. Prescott had now paused and was regarding Kennedy contemptuously. Kennedy paid no attention but continued. Perhaps these mysterious rays may shed some light on our minds, however. Now, for one thing, ultraviolet light passes readily through quartz, but is cut off by ordinary glass, especially if it is coated with chromium. Old Mr. Haswell did not wear glasses, therefore he was subject to the rays, the more so as he is a blonde, and I think it has been demonstrated by investigators that blondes are more affected by them than are brunettes. You have as part of your machine a peculiarly shaped quartz mercury vapor lamp, and the mercury vapor lamp of a design such as that I saw has been inverted for the especial purpose of producing ultraviolet rays in large quantity. There are also in your machine induction coils for the purpose of making an impressive noise, and a small electric furnace to heat the salted gold. I don't know what other ingenious fakes you have added. The visible bluish light from the tube is designed, I suppose, to hoodwink the credulous, but the dangerous thing about it is the invisible ray that accompanies the light. Mr. Haswell sat under those invisible rays, Prescott, never knowing how deadly they might be to him, an old man. You knew that they would not take effect for hours, and hence you ventured the prediction that he would be stricken at about midnight. Even if it was partial or temporary, still you would be safe in your prophecy. You succeeded better than you hoped in that part of your scheme. You had already prepared the way by means of a letter sent to Mr. Haswell through Dr. Burnham. But Mr. Haswell's credulity and fear worked the wrong way. Instead of appealing to you, he hated you. In his predicament, he thought only of his banished daughter and turned instinctively to her for help. That made necessary a quick change of plans. Prescott, far from losing his nerve, turned on us bitterly. I knew you two were spies the moment I saw you, he shouted. It seemed as if in some way I knew you for what you were, as if I knew you had seen Mr. Haswell before you came to me. You, too, would have robbed an inventor, as I am sure he would. But have a care, both of you. You may be punished also by blindness for your duplicity. Who knows? A shudder passed over me at the horrible thought contained in his mocking laugh. Were we doomed to blindness, too? I looked at the sightless man on the bed in alarm. I knew you would know us, retorted Kennedy calmly. Therefore we came provided with spectacles of euphos glass, precisely like those you wear. No, Prescott, we are safe, though perhaps we may have some burns like those red blotches on Mr. Haswell. Light burns. Prescott had fallen back a step, and Mrs. Martin was making an effort to appear stately and end the interview. No, continued Craig, suddenly wheeling, and startling us by the abruptness of his next exposure. It is you and your wife here, Mrs. Prescott, not Mrs. Martin, who must have a care. Stop glaring at each other. It is no use playing at enemies longer and trying to get rid of us. You overdo it. The game is up. Prescott made a rush at Kennedy, who seized him by the wrist and held him tightly in a grasp of steel that caused the veins on the back of his hands to stand out like whipcords. This is a deep-laid plot, he went on calmly, still holding Prescott, while I backed up against the door and cut off his wife. But it is not so difficult to see it after all. Your part was to destroy the eyesight of the old man, to make it necessary for him to call on his daughter. Your wife's part was to play the role of Mrs. Martin, whom we had not seen for years and could not see now. She was to persuade him, with her filial affection, to make her the beneficiary of his will, to see that his money was kept readily convertible into cash. Then, when the old man was at last out of the way, you two could decamp with what you could realize before the real daughter, cut off somewhere across the continent, could hear of the death of her father. It was an excellent scheme, but Haswell's plain material newspaper advertisement was not so effective for your purposes, Prescott, as the more artistic teleparogram, as you call it. Although you two got in first in answering the advertisement, it finally reached the right person after all. You didn't get away quickly enough. You were not expecting that the real daughter would see it and turn up soon, but she has. She lives in California. Mr. Haswell, in his delirium, has just told of receiving a telegram which I suppose you, Mrs. Prescott, read, destroyed, and acted upon. It hurried your plans, but you were equal to the emergency. Besides, possession is 9 points in the law. You tried the gas, making it look like a suicide. Jane, in her excitement, spoiled that, and Dr. Burnham, knowing where I was, as it happened, was able to summon me immediately. Circumstances have been against you from the first, Prescott." Craig was slowly twisting up the hand of the inventor, which he still held. With his other hand he pulled a paper from his pocket. It was the old envelope on which he had written upon the occasion of our first visit to Mr. Haswell, when we had been so unceremoniously interrupted by the visit of Dr. Scott. "I sat here yesterday by this bed," continued Craig, motioning toward the chair he had occupied, as I remembered. "Mr. Haswell was telling Dr. Scott something in an undertone. I could not hear it, but the old man grasped the doctor by the wrist to pull him closer and whisper to him. The doctor's hand was towards me, and I noticed the peculiar markings of the veins. You perhaps are not acquainted with the fact, but the markings of the veins in the back of the hand are peculiar to each individual, as infallible, indestructible, and ineffaceable as fingerprints or the shape of the ear. It is a system invented and developed by Professor Tamassia of the University of Padua, Italy. A superficial observer would say that all vein patterns were essentially similar, and many have said so, but Tamassia has found each to be characteristic and all subject to almost incredible diversities. There are 6 general classes in the case before us, 2 large veins crossed by a few secondary veins, forming a V with its base near the wrist. Already my suspicions had been aroused. I sketched the arrangement of the veins standing out on that hand. I noted the same thing just now on the hand that manipulated the fake apparatus in the laboratory. Despite the difference in makeup, Scott and Preston are the same. The invisible rays of the ultraviolet light may have blinded Mr. Haswell, even to the recognition of his own daughter, but you can rest assured, Prescott, that the very cleverness of your scheme will penetrate the eyes of the blindfolded goddess of justice. Burnham, if you will have the kindness to summon the police, I will take all the responsibility for the arrest of these people. End of The Invisible Ray. Recording by Elliott Miller. www.voiceofe.com.
Chapter 12 of The Poison Pen by Arthur B. Reeve. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elliott Miller. The Campaign Grafter. "What a relief it'll be when this election is over and the newspapers print news again," I growled as I turned the first page of the Star with a mere glance at the headlines. "Yes," observed Kennedy, who was puzzling over a note which he had received in the morning mail. "This is the bitterest campaign in years. Now, do you suppose they're after me in a professional way, or are they trying to round me up as an independent voter?" The letter which had called forth this remark was headed "The Travis Campaign Committee of the Reform League," and, as Kennedy evidently intended me to pass an opinion on it, I picked it up. It was only a few lines, requesting him to call during the morning, if convenient, on Wesley Travis, the candidate for governor, and the treasurer of his campaign committee, Dean Bennett. It had evidently been written in great haste in longhand the night before. "Professional," I hazarded. "There must be some scandal in the campaign for which they require your services." "I suppose so," said Craig. "Well, if it is business instead of politics, it has at least this merit. It is current business. I suppose you have no objection to going with me?" Thus it came about that, not very much later in the morning, we found ourselves at the campaign headquarters, in the presence of 2 nervous and high-keyed gentlemen in frock coats and silk hats. It would have taken no great astuteness, even without seeing the surroundings, to deduce instantly that they were engaged in the annual struggle of seeking the votes of their fellow citizens for something or other, and were nearly worn out by the arduous nature of the process. Their headquarters were in a tower of a skyscraper, whence poured forth a torrent of appeal to the moral sense of the electorate, both in printed and oral form. Yet there was a different tone to the place from that which I had ordinarily associated with political headquarters in previous campaigns. There was an absence of the old-fashioned politicians and of the air of intrigue laden with tobacco. Rather, there was an air of earnestness and efficiency which was decidedly prepossessing. Maps of the state were hanging on the walls, some stuck full of various colored pins denoting the condition of the canvass. A map of the city in colors,
divided into all sorts of districts, told how fared the battle in the stronghold of the boss, Billy McLaughlin. Huge systems of card indexes, loose-leaf devices, labor-saving appliances for getting out a vast mass of campaign literature in a hurry, in short, a perfect system such as a great, well-managed business might have been proud of, were in evidence everywhere. Wesley Travis was a comparatively young man, a lawyer who had early made a mark in politics and had been astute enough to shake off the thraldom of the bosses before the popular uprising against them. Now he was the candidate of the Reform League for governor, and a good stiff campaign he was putting up. His campaign manager, Dean Bennett, was a businessman whose financial interests were opposed to those usually understood to be behind Billy McLaughlin. Of the regular party to which both Travis and Bennett might naturally have been supposed to belong in the old days, indeed the Reform League owed its existence to a fortunate conjunction of both moral and economic conditions demanding progress. "Things have been going our way up to the present," began Travis confidentially, when we were seated democratically with our campaign cigars lighted. "Of course, we haven't had such a big barrel as our opponents, for we're not frying the fat out of the corporations. But the people have supported us nobly, and I think the opposition of the vested interests has been a great help. We seem to be winning, and I say seem only because one can never be certain how anything is going in this political game nowadays. You recall, Mr. Kennedy, reading in the papers that my country house out on Long Island was robbed the other day? Some of the reporters made much of it, and to tell the truth, I think they had become so satiated with sensations that they were sure that the thing was put up by some muckrakers, and that there would be an expose of some kind. For the thief, whoever he was, seems to have taken nothing from my library but a sort of scrapbook or album of photographs. It was a peculiar robbery, but as I had nothing to conceal, it didn't worry me. Well, I had all but forgotten it when a fellow came into Bennett's office here yesterday and demanded— tell us what it was, Bennett. You saw him." Bennett cleared his throat. "You see, it was this way. He gave his name as Harris Hanford and described himself as a photographer. I think he has done work for Billy McLaughlin. At any rate, his offer was to sell us several photographs, and his story about them was very circumstantial. He hinted that they had been evidently among those stolen from Mr. Travis, and that in a roundabout way they had come into the possession of a friend of his without his knowing who the thief was. He said that he had not made the photographs himself, but had an idea by whom they were made, and that the original plates had been destroyed, but that the person who made them was ready to swear that the pictures were taken after the nominating convention this fall, which had named Travis. At any rate, the photographs were out, and the price for them was $25,000. "What are they that he should set such a price on them?" asked Kennedy, keenly looking from Bennett quickly to Travis. Travis met his look without flinching. "They're supposed to be photographs of myself," he replied slowly. "One purports to represent me in a group on McLaughlin's porch at his farm on the south shore of the island, about 20 miles from my place. As Hanford describes it, I am standing between McLaughlin and J. Cadwallader Brown, the trust promoter who is backing McLaughlin to save his investments. Brown's hand is on my shoulder, and we are talking familiarly. Another is a picture of Brown, McLaughlin, and myself riding in Brown's car, and in it Brown and I are evidently on the best of terms. Oh, there are several of them, all in the same vein. Now," he added, and his voice rose with emotion as if he were addressing a cart-tail meeting which must be convinced that there was nothing criminal in riding in a motor car, "I don't hesitate to admit that a year or so ago I was not on terms of intimacy with these men, but at least acquainted with them. At various times, even as late as last spring, I was present at conferences over the presidential outlook in this state, and once I think I did ride back to the city with them. But I know that there were no pictures taken, and even if there had been, I would not care if they told the truth about them. I have frankly admitted in my speeches that I knew these men, that my knowledge of them and breaking from them is my chief qualification for waging an effective war on them if I am elected. They hate me cordially, you know that, What I do care about is the sworn allegation that now accompanies these fakes. They could not have been taken after the independent convention that nominated me. If the photographs were true, I would be a fine trader, but I haven't even seen McLaughlin or Brown since last spring. The whole truth is a lie from start to finish, put in Brown emphatically. Yes, Travis, we all know that. I'd quit right now if I didn't believe in you. But let us face the facts. Here's the story, sworn to as Hanford says and apparently acquiesced in by Billy McLaughlin and Cad Brown. What do they care anyhow as long as it is against you? And there, too, are the pictures themselves. At least they will be in print or suppressed according as we act. Now, you know that nothing could hurt the reform ticket worse than to have an issue like this raised at this time. We were supposed to at least be on the level, with nothing to explain away. There may just be enough people to believe that there is some basis for the suspicion to turn the tide against us. If it were earlier in the campaign, I'd say accept the issue, fight it out to a finish, and in the turn of events, we should really have the best campaign material. But it is too late now to expose such a knavish trick of theirs on the Friday before election. Frankly, I believe discretion is the better part of valor in this case, and without abating a jot of my faith in you, Travis, well, I'd pay first and expose the fraud afterward, after the election, at leisure. No, I won't, persisted Travis, shutting his square jaw doggedly. I won't be held up. The door had opened, and a young lady in a very stunning street dress, with a huge hat and a tantalizing veil, stood in it for a moment, hesitated, and then was about to shut it with an apology for intruding on a conference. I'll fight it if it takes my last dollar, declared Travis. But I won't be blackmailed out of a cent. Good morning, Miss Ashton. I'll be free in a moment. I'll see you in your office directly. The girl, with a portfolio of papers in her hand, smiled, and Travis quickly crossed the room and held the door deferentially open as he whispered a word or two. When she had disappeared, he returned and remarked, I suppose you have heard of Miss Margaret Ashton, the suffragette leader, Mr. Kennedy? She is head of our press bureau. Then a heightened look of determination set on his fine face in hard lines, and he brought his fist down on the desk. No, not a cent, he thundered. Bennett shrugged his shoulders hopelessly and looked at Kennedy in mock resignation as if to say, What can you do with such a fellow? Travis was excitedly pacing the floor and waving his arms as if he were addressing a meeting in the enemy's country. Hanford comes at us in this way, he continued, growing more excited as he paced up and down. He says plainly that the pictures will of course be accepted as among those stolen from me, and in that I suppose he's right. The public will swallow it. When Bennett told him I would prosecute, he laughed and said, Go ahead, I didn't steal the pictures. That would be a great joke for Travis to seek redress from the courts he is criticizing. I guess he wants to recall the decision if it went against him, eh? Hanford says that 100 copies had been made of each of the photographs and that this person, whom we do not know, has them ready to drop into the mail to the 100 leading papers of the state in time for them to appear in the Monday editions just before Election Day. He says no amount of denying on our part can destroy the effect, or at least he went further and said, shake their validity. But I repeat they are false. For all I know, it is a plot of Mr. McLaughlin's, the last fight of a boss for his life, driven into a corner, and it is meaner than if he had attempted to forge a letter. Pictures appeal to the eye and mind much more than letters. That's what makes the thing so dangerous. Billy McLaughlin knows how to make the use of such a roarback on the eve of an election, and even if I not only deny but prove they are fake, I'm afraid the harm will be done. I can't reach all the voters in time. 10 see such a change to 1 who sees the denial. Just so, persisted Bennett coolly. You admit they are practically helpless. That's what I have been saying all along. Get control of the prints first, Travis, for God's sake. Then raise any kind of how you want, before election or after. As I say, if we had a week or two, it might be all right to fight, but we can make no move without making fools of ourselves until they are published Monday as the last big thing of the campaign. The rest of Monday and the Tuesday morning papers do not give us time to reply. Even if they were published today, we should hardly have time to expose the plot, hammer it in, and make the issue an asset instead of a liability. No, you must admit it yourself. There isn't time. We must carry out the work we have so carefully planned to cap the campaign, and if we are diverted by this, it means a let-up in our final efforts. And that is as good as McLaughlin wants anyhow. Now, Kennedy, don't you agree with me? Squelch the pictures now at any cost and follow the thing up and, if we can, prosecute after election. Kennedy and I, who had been so far little more than interested spectators, had not presumed to interrupt. Finally Craig asked, "You have copies of the pictures?" "No," replied Bennett. "This Hanford is a brazen fellow, but he was too astute to leave them. I saw them for an instant. They look bad, and the affidavits with them look worse." Considered Kennedy, turning the crisis over in his mind. "We have alleged stolen and forged letters before, but alleged stolen and forged photographs are new. I'm not surprised that you're alarmed, Bennett, nor that you want to fight, Travis." "Then you will take up the case?" urged the latter eagerly, forgetting both his campaign manager and his campaign manners, and leaning forward almost like a prisoner in the dock to catch the words of the foreman of the jury. "You will trace down the forger of those pictures before it is too late?" "I haven't said I'll do that yet," answered Craig measuredly. "I haven't even said I'd take up the case. Politics is a new game to me, Mr. Travis. If I go into this thing, I want to go into it and stay in it. Well, you know how you lawyers put it, with clean hands. On one condition, I'll take this matter up, and on only one." "Name it," cried Travis anxiously. "Of course, having been retained by you," continued Craig with provoking slowness, "it is not reasonable to suppose that if I find— how shall I put it bluntly? Yes, if I find that the story of Hanford has some foundation, it is not reasonable to suppose that I should desert you and go over to the other side. Neither is it to be supposed that I will continue and carry such a thing through for you regardless of truth. What I ask is to have a free hand, to be able to drop the case the moment I cannot proceed further in justice to myself. Drop it and keep my mouth shut. You understand? These are my conditions, and no less." "And you think you can make good?" questioned Bennett rather skeptically. "You are willing to risk it? You don't think it would be better to wait until after the election is won?" "You've heard my conditions," reiterated Craig. "Done," broke in Travis. "I'm going to fight it out, Bennett. If we get in wrong by dickering with them at the start, it may be worse for us in the end. Paying amounts to confession." Bennett shook his head dubiously. "I'm afraid this will suit McLaughlin's purpose just as well. Photographs are like statistics. They don't lie unless the people who make them do. But it's hard to tell what a liar can accomplish with either in an election." "Say, Dean, you're not going to desert me," reproached Travis. "You're not offended at my kicking over the traces, are you?" Bennett rose, placed a hand on Travis's shoulder, and grasped his other. "Wesley," he said earnestly, "I wouldn't desert you even if the pictures were true." "I knew it," responded Travis heartily. "Then let Mr. Kennedy have one day to see what he can do. Then if we can make no progress, we'll take your advice, Dean. We'll pay, I suppose, and ask Mr. Kennedy to continue the case after next Tuesday." "With the proviso," put in Craig. "With the proviso, Kennedy," repeated Travis. "Your hand on that. Say, I think I've shaken hands with half the male population of this state since I was nominated, but this means more to me than any of them. Call on us, either Bennett or myself, the moment you need aid. Spare no reasonable expense, and get the goods, no matter whom it hits higher up, even if it is Cadwallader Brown himself. Goodbye and 1,000 thanks. Oh, by the way, wait. Let me take you around and introduce you to Miss Ashton. She may be able to help you." The office of Bennett and Travis was in the center of the suite. On one side were the cashier and clerical forces, as well as the speaker's bureau, where spellbinders of all degrees were getting instruction. Tours were being laid out, and reports received from meetings already held. On the other side was the press bureau with a large and active force in charge of Miss Ashton, who was supporting Travis because he had most emphatically declared for votes for women and had insisted that his party put this plank on its platform. Miss Ashton was a clever girl, a graduate of a famous women's college, and had had several years of newspaper experience before she became a leader in the suffrage cause. I recalled having read and heard a great deal about her, though I had never met her. The Ashtons were well known in New York society, and it was a sore trial to some of her conservative friends that she would reject what they considered the proper sphere for women. Among those friends, I understood, was Cadwallader Brown himself. Travis had scarcely more than introduced us, yet already I scented a romance behind the ordinarily prosaic conduct of a campaign press bureau. It is far from my intention to minimize the work or the ability of the head of the press bureau, but it struck me, both then and later, that the candidate had an extraordinary interest in the newspaper campaign, much more than the Speaker's Bureau, and I am sure that it was not solely accounted for by the fact that publicity is playing a more and more important part in political campaigning. Nevertheless, such innovations as her cardinal system by election districts all over the state, showing the attitude of the various newspaper editors, of local political leaders, and changes of sentiment, were very full and valuable. Kennedy, who had a regular pigeonhole mind for facts, was visibly impressed by this huge mechanical memory built up by Miss Ashton. Though he said nothing to me, I knew he had also observed the state of affairs between the reform candidate and the suffrage leader. It was at a moment when Travis had been called back to his office that Kennedy, who had been eyeing Miss Ashton with marked approval, leaned over and said in a low voice, "Miss Ashton, I think I can trust you. Do you want to do a great favor for Mr. Travis?" She did not betray even by a fleeting look on her face what the true state of her feelings was, although I fancied that the readiness of her assent had perhaps more meaning than she would have placed in a simple yes otherwise. "I suppose you know that an attempt is being made to blackmail Mr. Travis?" asked Kennedy quickly. "I know something about it," she replied in a tone which left it for granted that Travis had told her before even we were called in. I felt that not unlikely Travis's set determination to fight might be traceable to her advice, or at least to her opinion of him. "I suppose in a large force like this it is not impossible that your political enemies may have a spy or two," observed Kennedy, glancing about at the score or more clerks busily engaged in getting out literature. "I have sometimes thought that myself," she agreed, "but of course I don't know. Still, I have to be pretty careful. Someone is always over here by my desk or looking over here. There isn't much secrecy in a big room like this. I never leave important stuff lying about where any of them could see it." "Yes," mused Kennedy. "What time does the office close?" "We shall finish tonight about 9, I think. Tomorrow it may be later." "Well then, if I should call here tonight at, say, 9:30, could you be here? I need hardly say that your doing so may be of inestimable value to the campaign." "I shall be here," she promised, giving her hand with a peculiar straight-arm shake and looking him frankly in the face with those eyes which even the old guard in the legislature admitted were vote-winners. Kennedy was not quite ready to leave yet, but sought out Travis and obtained permission to glance over the financial end of the campaign. There were very few large contributors to Travis's fund, but a host of small sums ranging from $10 and $25 down to dimes and nickels. Truly, it showed the depth of the popular uprising. Kennedy also glanced hastily over the items of expense: rent, salaries, stenographer and office force, advertising, printing and stationery, postage, telephone, telegraph, automobile and traveling expenses, and miscellaneous matters. As Kennedy expressed it afterwards, as against the small driblets of money coming in, large sums were going out for expenses in lumps. Campaigning in these days costs money, even when done honestly. The miscellaneous account showed some large, indefinite items, and after a hasty calculation, Kennedy made out that if all the obligations had to be met immediately, the committee would be in the hole for several $1,000s. "In short," I argued as we were leaving, "this will either break Travis privately or put his fund in hopeless shape. Or does it mean that he foresees defeat and is taking this way to recoup himself under cover of being held up?" Kennedy said nothing in response to my suspicions, though I could see that in his mind he was leaving no possible clue unnoted. It was only a few blocks to the studio of Harris Hanford, whom Kennedy was now bent on seeing.
We found him in an old building on one of the side streets in the 30s, which businesses had captured. His was a little place on the top floor, up 3 flights of stairs, and I noticed as we climbed up that the room next to his was vacant. Our interview with Hanford was short and unsatisfactory. He either was or at least posed as representing a third party in the affair, and absolutely refused to permit us to have even a glance at the photographs. "My dealings," he asserted airily, "must be all with Mr. Bennett, or with Mr. Travis direct, not with emissaries. I don't make any secret about it. The prints are not here. They are safe and ready to be produced at the right time, either to be handed over for the money or to be published in the newspapers. We had found out all about them. We are satisfied, although the negatives have been destroyed. As for their having been stolen from Mr. Travis, you can put 2 and 2 together. They are out and copies have been made of them, good copies. If Mr. Travis wishes to repudiate them, let him start proceedings. I told Bennett all about that. Tomorrow is the last day, and I must have Bennett's answer then, without any interlopers coming into it. If it is yes, well and good. If not, then they know what to expect. Goodbye." It was still early in the forenoon, and Kennedy's next move was to go out on Long Island to examine the library at Travis's, from which the pictures were said to have been stolen. At the laboratory, Kennedy and I loaded ourselves with a large oblong black case containing a camera and a tripod. His examination of the looted library was minute, taking in the window through which the thief had apparently entered, the cabinet he had forced, and the situation in general. Finally, Craig set up his camera with most particular care and took several photographs of the window, the cabinet, the doors, including the room from every angle. Outside, he snapped the 2 sides of the corner of the house in which the library was situated. Partly by trolley and partly by carriage we crossed the island on the south shore, and finally found McLaughlin's farm, where we had no trouble in getting 6 photographs of the porch and house. Although the proceeding seemed tame to me, yet I knew from previous experience that Kennedy had a deep-laid purpose. We parted in the city, to meet just before it was time to visit Miss Ashton. Kennedy had evidently employed the interval in developing his plates, for now he had 10 or a dozen prints, all of exactly the same size, mounted on stiff cardboard in a space with scales and figures on all 4 sides. He saw me puzzling over them. "These are metric photographs such as Bertillon of Paris takes," he explained. "By means of the scales and tables and other methods that have been worked out, we can determine from those pictures distances and many other things almost as well as if we were on the spot itself. Bertillon has cleared up many crimes with this help, such as the mystery of the shooting in the Hotel Quai d'Orsay and other cases. The metric photograph, I believe, will in time rank with the portrait parlé, fingerprints, and the rest. For instance, in order to solve the riddle of a crime, the detective's first task is to study the scene topographically. Plans and elevations of a room or house are made. The position of each object is painstakingly noted. In addition, the all-seeing eye of the camera is called into requisition. The plundered room is photographed, as in this case. I might have done it by placing a foot rule on a table and taking that in the picture, but a more scientific and accurate method has been devised by Bertillon. His camera lens is always used at a fixed height from the ground and forms its image on the plate at an exact focus. The print made from the negative is mounted on a card in a space of definite size, along the edges of which a metric scale is printed. In the way he has worked out, the distance between any 2 points in the picture can be determined. With a topographical plan and a metric photograph, one can study a crime as a general studies the map of a strange country. There were several peculiar things that I observed today, and I have here indelible record of the scene of the crime. Preserved in this way, it cannot be questioned. Now, the photographs were in this cabinet. There are other cabinets, but none of them has been disturbed. Therefore, the thief must have known just what he was after. The marks made in breaking the lock were not those of a jimmy, but of a screwdriver. No amazing command of the resources of science is needed so far. All that is necessary is a little scientific common sense, Walter. Now, how did the robber get in? All the windows and doors were supposedly locked. It is alleged that a pane was cut from this window at the side. It was, and the pieces were there to show it, But take a glance at this outside photograph. To reach that window, even a tall man must have stood on a ladder or something. There are no marks of a ladder or of any person in the soft soil under the window. What is more, that window was cut from the inside. The marks of the diamond which cut it plainly shows that. Scientific common sense again. Then it must have been someone in the house, or at least someone familiar with it? I exclaimed. Kennedy nodded. One thing we have which the police greatly neglect, he pursued, a record. We have made some progress in reconstructing the crime, as Bertillon calls it. If we only had those Hanford pictures, we should be all right. We were now on our way to see Miss Ashton at headquarters. As we rode downtown, I tried to reason out the case. Had it really been a put-up job? Was Travis himself faking? And was the robbery a plant by which he might forestall exposure of what had become public property in the hands of another, no longer disposed to conceal it? Or was it, after all, the last desperate blow of the boss? The whole thing began to assume a suspicious look in my mind, although Kennedy seemed to have made little real progress. I felt that, far from aiding Travis, it made things darker. There was nothing but his unsupported word that he had not visited the boss subsequent to the nominating convention. He admitted having done so before the Reform League came into existence. Besides, it seemed tacitly understood that both the boss and Cadwallader Brown acquiesced in the sworn statement of the man who said he had made the pictures. Added to that, the mere existence of the actual pictures themselves was a graphic clincher to the story. Personally, if I had been in Kennedy's place, I think I should have taken advantage of the proviso in the compact with Travis to back out gracefully. Kennedy, however, now started on the case, hung to it tenaciously. Miss Ashton was waiting for us at the press bureau. Her desk was at the middle of one end of the room in which, if she could keep an eye on her office force, the office force could also keep an eye on her. Kennedy had apparently taken in the arrangement during our morning visit, for he set to work immediately. The side of the room toward the office of Travis and Bennett presented an expanse of blank wall. With a mallet, he quickly knocked a hole in the rough plaster, just above the baseboard about the room. The hole did not penetrate quite through to the other side. In it he placed a round disc of vulcanized rubber, with insulated wires leading down back of the baseboard, then out underneath it, and under the carpet. Some plaster quickly closed up the cavity in the wall, and he left it to dry. Next, he led the wires under the carpet to Miss Ashton's desk. There they ended, under the carpet, and a rug 18 or 20 huge coils of several feet in diameter disposed in such a way as to attract no attention by a curious foot on the carpet which covered them. "That is all, Miss Ashton," he said as we watched for his next move. "I shall want to see you early tomorrow, and might I ask you to be sure to wear the hat which you have on?" It was a very becoming hat, but Kennedy's tone clearly indicated that it was not his taste in inverted basket millinery that prompted the request. She promised, smiling, for even a suffragette may like pretty hats. Craig had still to see Travis and report on his work. The candidate was waiting anxiously at his hotel after a big political mass meeting on the East Side, at which capitalism and the bosses had been hissed to the echo, if that was possible. "What success?" inquired Travis eagerly. "I'm afraid," replied Kennedy, and the candidate's face fell at the tone. "I'm afraid you will have to meet them for the present. The time limit will expire tomorrow, and I understand Hanford is coming up for a final answer. We must have copies of those photographs, even if we have to pay for them. There seems to be no other way." Travis sank back in his chair and regarded Kennedy hopelessly. He was actually pale. You don't mean to say that there's no other way, that I'll have to admit even before Bennett and others that I'm in bad?" "I wouldn't put it that way," said Kennedy mercilessly, I thought. "It is that way," Travis asserted almost fiercely. "Why, we could have done that anyhow. No, I don't mean that. Pardon me. I'm upset by this. Go ahead," he sighed. "You will direct Bennett to make the best terms he can with Hanford when he comes up tomorrow. Have him arrange the details of payment, and then rush the best copies of the photograph to me." Travis seemed crushed. We met Miss Ashton the following morning entering her office. Kennedy handed her a package, and, in a few words which I did not hear, explained what he wanted, promising to call again later. When we called, the girls and the other clerks had arrived, and the office was a hive of industry in a rush of winding up the campaign. Typewriters were clicking, clippings were being snipped out of a huge stack of newspapers and pasted into large scrapbooks. Circulars were being folded and made ready to mail for the final appeal. The room was indeed crowded, and I felt that there was no doubt, as Kennedy had said, that nothing much could go on there unobserved by anyone to whose interest it was to see it. Miss Ashton was sitting at her desk with her hat on directing the work. "It works," she remarked enigmatically to Kennedy. "Good," he replied. "I merely dropped in to be sure. Now, if anything of interest happens, Miss Ashton, I wish you would let me know immediately. I must not be seen up here, but I shall be waiting downstairs in the corridor of the building. My next move depends entirely on what you have to report." Downstairs, Craig waited with growing impatience. We stood in an angle in which we could see without being readily seen, and our impatience was not diminished by seeing Hanford enter the elevator. I think that Miss Ashton would have made an excellent woman detective, that is, on a case on which her personal feelings were not involved as they were here. She was pale and agitated as she appeared in the corridor, and Kennedy hurried toward her. "I can't believe it. I won't believe it," she managed to say. "Tell me what happened," urged Kennedy soothingly. "Oh, Mr. Kennedy, why did you ask me to do this?" she reproached. "I would almost rather not to have known at all." "Believe me, Miss Ashton," said Kennedy, "you ought to know. It is on you that I depend most. We saw Hanford go up. What occurred?" She was still pale, and replied nervously. "Mr. Bennett came in about 9:45. He stopped to talk to me and looked about the room curiously. Do you know, I felt very uncomfortable for a time. Then he locked the door leading from the press bureau to his office, and left word that he was not to be disturbed. A few minutes later a man called. Yes, prompted Kennedy. Hanford, no doubt." She was racing on breathlessly, scarcely giving one a chance to inquire how she had learned so much. "Why," she cried with a sort of defiant ring in her tone, "Mr. Travis is going to buy those pictures after all. And the worst of it is that I met him in the hall coming in as I was coming down here, and he tried to act toward me in the same old way, and that after all I know about him. They have fixed it all up, Mr. Bennett acting for Mr. Travis and this Mr. Hanford. They're even going to ask me to carry the money in a sealed envelope to the studio of this fellow Hanford, to be given to a third person who will be there at 2 o'clock this afternoon." "You, Miss Ashton?" inquired Kennedy, a light breaking on his face as if he at last saw something. "Yes, I," she repeated. "Hanford insisted that it was part of the compact. They haven't asked me openly yet to be the means of carrying out their dirty deals, but when they do, I won't—" "Miss Ashton," remonstrated Kennedy, "I beg you to be calm. I had no idea that you would take it like this. No idea. Please, Walter, will you excuse us if we take a turn down the corridor and out in the air? This is most extraordinary." For 5 or 10 minutes Kennedy and Miss Ashton appeared to be discussing the new turn of events earnestly, while I waited impatiently. As they approached again she seemed calmer, but I heard her say, "I hope you're right. I'm all broken up by it. I'm ready to resign. My faith in human nature is shaken. No, I won't expose Wesley Travis for his sake. It cuts me to have to admit it, but Cadwallader used always to say that every man has his price. I am afraid this will do great harm to the cause of reform, and through it to the woman suffrage cause which cast its lot with this party. I can hardly believe." Kennedy was still looking earnestly at her. "Miss Ashton," he implored, "believe nothing. Remember, one of the first rules of politics is loyalty. Wait until—" "Wait," she echoed. "How can I? I hate Wesley Travis for giving in, more than I hate Cadwallader Brown for his cynical disregard of honesty in others." She bit her lip at thus betraying her feelings, but what she had heard had evidently affected her deeply. It was as though the feet of her idol had turned to clay. Nevertheless, it was evident that she was coming to look on it more as she would if she were an outsider. "Just think it over," urged Kennedy. "They won't ask you right away. Don't do anything rash. Suspend judgment. You won't regret it." Craig's next problem seemed to be to transfer the scene of his operations to Hansford's studio. He was apparently doing some rapid thinking as we walked uptown after leaving Miss Ashton. and I did not venture to question him on what had occurred when it was so evident that everything depended on being prepared for what was still to occur. Hanford was out. That seemed to please Kennedy, for with a brightening face, which told me more surely than words that he saw his way more and more clearly, he asked me to visit the agent and hire the vacant office next to the studio while he went uptown to complete his arrangements for the final step. I had completed my part and was waiting in the empty room when he returned. He lost no time in getting to work, and it seemed to me as I watched him curiously in silence that he was repeating what he had already done at the Travis headquarters. He was boring into the wall, only this time he did it much more carefully, and it was evident that if he intended putting anything into this cavity, it must be pretty large. The hole was square, and as I bent over I could see that he had cut through the plaster and laths all the way to the wallpaper on the other side, though he was careful to leave that intact. Then he set up a square black box in the cavity, carefully poising it and making measurements that told of the exact location of its center with reference to the partitions and walls. A skeleton key took us into Hanford's well-lighted but now empty studio. For Miss Ashton's sake, I wish that the photographs had been there. I am sure Kennedy would have found slight compunction in a larceny of them if they had been. It was something entirely different that he had in mind now, however, and he was working quickly for fear of discovery. By his measurements, I guessed that he was calculating as nearly as possible the center of the box which he had placed in the hole in the wall on the other side of the dark wallpaper. When he had quite satisfied himself, he took a fine pencil from his pocket and made a light cross on the paper to indicate it. The dot fell to the left of a large calendar hanging on the wall. Kennedy's appeal to Margaret Ashton had evidently had its effect, for when we saw her a few moments after these mysterious preparations, she had overcome her emotion. "They have asked me to carry a note to Mr. Hanford's studio," she said quietly, "and without letting them know that I know anything about it, I have agreed to do so." "Miss Ashton," said Kennedy, greatly relieved, "you're a trump."
"No," she replied, smiling faintly. "I'm just feminine enough to be curious."
Craig shook his head, but did not dispute the point. "After you have handed the envelope to the person, whoever it may be, in Hanford's studio, wait until he does something suspicious. Meanwhile, look at the wall on the side toward the next vacant office. To the left of the big calendar you will see a light pencil mark, a cross. Somehow you must contrive to get near it, but don't stand in front of it. Then, if anything happens, stick this little number 10 needle in the wall right at the intersection of the cross. Withdraw it quickly, count 15, then put this little sticker over the cross, and get out as best you can, though we shan't be far away if you should need us. That's all." We did not accompany her to the studio for fear of being observed, but waited impatiently in the next office. We could hear nothing of what was said, but when a door shut and it was evident that she had gone, Kennedy quickly removed something from the box in the wall covered with a black cloth. As soon as it was safe, Kennedy had sent me posting after her to secure copies of the incriminating photographs which were to be carried by her from the studio, while he remained to see who came out. I thought a change had come over her as she handed me the package, with the request that I carry it to Mr. Bennett and get them from him. The first inkling I had that Kennedy had at last been able to trace back something in the mysterious doings of the past 2 days came the following evening, when Craig remarked casually that he would like to have me call on Billy McLaughlin if I had no engagement. I replied that I had none, and managed to squirm out of the one I really had. The boss's office was full of politicians, for it was the eve of Doe Day, when the purse strings were loosed and a flood of potent argument poured forth to turn the tides of election. Hanford was there with the other ward healers. "Mr. McLaughlin," began Kennedy quietly, when we were seated alone with Hanford in the little sanctum of the boss, You will pardon me if I seem a little slow in coming to the business that has brought me here tonight. First of all, I may say, and you, Hanford, being a photographer, will appreciate it, that ever since the days of Daguerre, photography has been regarded as the one infallible means of portraying faithfully any object, scene, or action. Indeed, a photograph is admitted in court as irrefutable evidence. For when everything else fails, a picture made through the photographic lens almost invariably turns the tide. However, such a picture upon which the fate of an important case may rest should be subjected to critical examination, for it is an established fact that a photograph may be made as untruthful as it may be reliable. Combination photographs change entirely the character of the initial negative and have been made for the past 50 years. The earliest, simplest, and most harmless photographic deception is the printing of clouds onto a bare sky. But the retoucher with his pencil and etching tool today is very skillful. A workman of ordinary skill can introduce a person taken in a studio into an open-air scene, well blended and in complete harmony, without a visible trace of falsity. I need say nothing of how one head can be put on another body in a picture, nor need I say what a double exposure will do. There is almost no limit to the changes that may be wrought in form and feature. It is possible to represent a person crossing Broadway, or walking on Riverside Drive, places he may never have visited. Thus a person charged with an offense may be able to prove an alibi by the aid of a skillfully prepared combination photograph. Where, then, can photography be considered irrefutable evidence? The realism may convince all, will convince all, except the expert and the initiated after careful study. A shrewd judge will insist that in every case the negative be submitted and examined for possible alterations by a clever manipulator. Kennedy bent his gaze on McLaughlin. Now, I do not accuse you, sir, of anything, but a photograph has come into the possession of Mr. Travis in which he is represented as standing on the steps of your house with yourself and Mr. Cadwallader Brown. He and Mr. Brown are in poses that show the utmost friendliness. I do not hesitate to say that that was originally a photograph of yourself, Mr. Brown, and your own candidate. It is a pretty raw deal, a fake in which Travis had been substituted by very excellent photographic forgery. McLaughlin motioned to Hanford to reply. "A fake?" repeated the latter contemptuously. "How about the affidavits? There's no negative. You got to prove that the original print's stolen from Travis. We'll say it's a fake. You can't do it." "September 19th was the date alleged, I believe?" asked Travis quietly, laying down the bundle of metric photographs and the alleged photographs of Travis. He was pointing to a shadow of a gable on the house as it showed in the metric photographs and the others. "You see that shadow of the gable? Perhaps you've never heard of it, Hanford, but it is possible to tell the exact time at which a photograph was taken from a study of the shadows. It is possible in principle and practice and can be trusted. Almost any scientist may be called on to bear testimony in court nowadays, but you would say the astronomer is one of the least likely. Well, the shadow in this picture will prove an alibi for someone. Notice, it is seen very prominently to the right, and its exact location on the house is an easy matter. You could almost use the metric photograph for that. The identification of the gable casting the shadow is easy. To be exact, it is 19.62 feet high. The shadow is 14.23 feet down, 13.10 feet east, and 3.43 feet north. You see I'm exact. I have to be. In 1 minute it moved 0.080 feet upward, 0.053 feet to the right, and 0.096 feet in its apparent path. It passes the width of a weatherboard, 0.37 foot, in 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Kennedy was talking rapidly of data which he had derived from his metric photograph, from plumb line, level, compass, and tape, astronomical triangle, vertices, zenith, pole and sun, declination, azimuth, solar time, parallactic angles, refraction, and a dozen bewildering terms. In spherical trigonometry, he concluded, to solve the problem 3 elements must be known. I knew 4. Therefore, I could take each of the known, treat it as an unknown, and have 4 ways to check my result. I find that the time might have been either 3 o'clock, 21 minutes and 12 seconds in the afternoon, or 3:21:31, or 3:21:29, or 3:21:33. The average is 3:21:26, and therefore be no appreciable error except for a few seconds. For that date must have been one of 2 days, either May 22nd or July 22nd. Between these 2 dates we must decide on evidence other than the shadow. It must have been in May, as the immature condition of the foliage shows, but even if it had been in July, it is far from being in September. The matter of the year I have also settled. Weather conditions, I find, were favorable on all these dates except that in September. I can really answer with an assurance and accuracy superior to that of the photographer himself, even if he were honest, as to the real date. The real picture, aside from being doctored, was actually taken last May. Science is not fallible, but exact in this matter. Kennedy had scored a palpable hit. McLaughlin and Hanford were speechless. Still, Craig hurried on. But you may ask, how about the automobile picture? That also is an unblushing fake. Of course, I must prove that. In the first place, you know that the general public has come to recognize the distortion of a photograph as denoting speed. A picture of a car in a race that doesn't lean is rejected. People demand to see speed, speed, and more speed, even in pictures. Distortion does indeed show speed, but that, too, can be faked. Hanford knows that the image is projected upside down by the lens on the plate, and that the bottom of the picture is taken before the top. The camera mechanism admits light, which makes the picture in the manner of a roller-blind curtain. The slit travels from the top to the bottom, and the image on the plate being projected upside down, the bottom of the object appears on the top of the plate. For instance, the wheels are taken before the head of the driver. If the car is moving quickly, the image moves on the plate, and each successive part is taken a little in advance of the last. The whole leans forward. By widening the slit and slowing the speed of the shutter, there is more distortion. Now, this is what happened. A picture was taken of Cadwallader Brown's automobile, probably at rest with Brown in it. The matter of faking Travis or anyone else by his side is simple. If with an enlarging lantern the image of this faked picture is thrown on the paper like a lantern slide, and if the right-hand side is a little further away than the left, the top further away than the bottom, you can print a fraudulent high-speed ahead picture. True, everything else in the picture, even if motionless, is distorted, and the difference between this faking and the distortion of the shutter can be seen by an expert. But it will pass. In this case, however, the faker was so sure of that he was careless. Instead of getting the plate further from the paper on the right, he did so on the left. It was further away on the bottom than on the top. He got distortion all right, enough still to satisfy the uninitiated, but it was distortion in the wrong way. The top of the wheel, which goes fastest and ought to be most indistinct, is in the fake as sharp as any other part. It is a small mistake, but fatal. That picture is really at high speed, backwards. It is too raw, too raw. You don't think people are going to swallow all that stuff, do you? Asked Hanford coolly, in spite of the exposures. Kennedy paid no attention. He was looking at McLaughlin. The boss was regarding him surlily. Well, he said at length, what of all this? I have nothing to do with it. Why do you come to me? Take it to the proper parties. Shall I? Asked Kennedy quietly. He had uncovered another picture carefully. We could not see it, but as he looked at it, McLaughlin fairly staggered. Where did you get that? He gasped. I got it where I got it, and it is no fake, replied Kennedy enigmatically. Then he appeared to think better of it. This, he explained, is what is known as a pinhole photograph. 300 years ago, Della Porta knew the camera obscura, and, but for the lack of a sensitive plate, would have made photographs. A box, thoroughly light-tight, slotted inside to receive plates, covered with black and glued tight, a needle hole made by a number 10 needle in a thin sheet of paper, and you have the apparatus for lensless photography. It has a correctness such as no image-forming means by lenses can have. It is literally rectographic, rectilinear, and needs no focusing, and it takes a wide angle with equal effect. Even pinhole snapshots are possible where the light is abundant, with a 10 to 15 second exposure. That picture, McLaughlin, was taken yesterday at Hanford's. After Miss Ashton left, I saw who came out, but this picture shows what happened before. At a critical moment, Miss Ashton stuck a needle in the wall of the studio, counted 15, closed the needle hole, and there is the record. Walter, Hanford, leave us alone an instant. When Kennedy passed out of the boss's office, there was a look of quiet satisfaction on his face which I could not fathom. Not a word could I extract from him either that night or on the following day, which was the last before the election. I must say that I was keenly disappointed by the lack of developments, however. The whole thing seemed to me to be a mess. Everybody was involved. What had Miss Ashton overheard, and what had Kennedy said to McLaughlin? Above all, what was his game? Was he playing to spare the girl's feelings by allowing the election to go on without a scandal for Travis? At last election night arrived. We were all at the Travis headquarters, Kennedy, Travis, Bennett, and myself. Miss Ashton was not present, but the first returns had scarcely begun to trickle in when Craig whispered to me to go out and find her, either at her home or club. I found her at home. She had apparently lost interest in the election, and it was with difficulty that I persuaded her to accompany me. The excitement of any other night in the year paled to insignificance before this. Distracted crowds everywhere were cheering and blowing horns. Now a series of wild shouts broke forth from the dense mass of people before a newspaper bulletin board. Now came sullen groans, hisses, and catcalls, or all together with cheers as the return swung in another direction. Not even baseball could call out such a crowd as this. Lights blazed everywhere. Automobiles honked and grounded their gears. The lobster palaces were thronged. Police were everywhere. People with horns and bells and all manner of noise-making devices pushed up one side of the thoroughfares and down the other. Hungrily, ravenously, they were feeding on the meager bulletins of news. Yet, back of all the noise and human energy, I could only think of the silent, systematic gathering and editing of the news. High up in the League headquarters when we returned, a corps of clerks was tabulating returns, comparing official and semi-official reports. At first the state swung one way, then another. Our hopes rose and fell. Miss Ashton seemed cold and ill at ease, while Travis looked more worried and paid less attention to the returns than would have seemed natural. She avoided him, and he seemed to hesitate to seek her out. Would the upstate returns, I had wondered at first, be large enough to overcome the hostile city vote? I was amazed now to see how strongly the city was turning to Travis. "McLaughlin has kept his word," ejaculated Kennedy, as district after district showed that the boss's pluralities were being seriously cut into. "His word? What do you mean?" we asked almost together. "I mean that he has kept his word given to me at a conference which Mr. Jameson saw but did not hear. I told him I would publish the whole thing, not caring whom or where or when it hit if he did not let up on Travis. I advised him to read his revised statutes again about money in elections, and I ended up with the threat, 'There will be no dough day, McLaughlin, or this will be prosecuted to the limit.' There was no dough day. You see the effect in the returns." "But how did you do it?" I asked, not comprehending. "The faked photographs did not move him. That I could see." The words "faked photographs" caused Miss Ashton to glance up quickly. I saw that Kennedy had not told her or anyone yet until the boss had made good. He had simply arranged one of his little dramas. "Shall I tell Miss Ashton?" he asked, adding, "before I complete my part of the compact and blot out the whole affair?" "I have no right to say no," she answered tremulously, but with a look of happiness that I had not seen since our first introduction. Kennedy laid down a print on a table. It was the pinhole photograph, a little blurry, but quite convincing. On the desk in the picture was a pile of bills. McLaughlin was shoving them away from him toward Bennett. A man who was facing forward in the picture was talking earnestly to someone who did not appear. I felt intuitively, even before Kennedy said so, that the person was Miss Ashton herself as she stuck the needle into the wall. The man was Cadwallader Brown. "Travis," demanded Kennedy, "bring the account books of your campaign. I want the miscellaneous account particularly." The books were brought, and he continued turning the leaves. "It seems to me to show a shortage of nearly $20,000 the other day. Why, it has been made up. How was that, Bennett?" Bennett was speechless. "I will tell you," Craig proceeded inexorably. "Bennett, you embezzled that money for your business. Rather than be found out, you went to Billy McLaughlin and offered to sell out the reform campaign for money to replace it. With the aid of the crook, Hanford, McLaughlin's tool, you worked out the scheme to extort money from Travis by forged photographs. You knew enough about Travis's house and library to frame up a robbery one night when you were staying there with him. It was inside work, I found at a glance. Travis, I am sorry to have to tell you that your confidence was misplaced. It was Bennett who robbed you, and worse." But Cadwallader Brown, always close to his creature, Billy McLaughlin, heard of it. To him it presented another idea. To him it offered a chance to overthrow a political enemy and a hated rival for Miss Ashton's hand. Perhaps, into the bargain, it would disgust her with politics, disillusion her, and shake her faith in what she believed to be some of her radical notions. All could be gained at one blow. They say that a checkbook knows no politics, but Bennett has learned some, I venture to say, and to save his reputation, he will pay back what he has tried to graft. Travis could scarcely believe it yet. "How did you get your first hint?" he gasped. Kennedy was digging into the wall with a bill file at the place where he had buried the little vulcanized disc. I had already guessed that it was a dictograph, though I could not tell how it was used or who used it. There it was, set squarely in the plaster. There also were the wires running under the carpet. As he lifted the rug under Miss Ashton's desk, there also lay huge circles of wire. That was all. At this moment Miss Ashton stepped forward. "Last Friday," she said in a low tone, "I wore a belt which concealed a coil of wire about my waist. From it a wire ran under my coat, connecting with a small dry battery in a pocket. Over my head I had arrangements such as the telephone girls wear with the receiver by one ear connected with the battery. No one saw it, for I wore a large hat which completely hid it. If anyone had known, and there were plenty of eyes watching, the whole thing would have fallen through. I could walk around, no one could suspect anything, but when I stood or sat at my desk, I could hear everything that was said in Mr. Bennett's office." "By induction," explained Kennedy. "The impulses set up in the concealed dictograph set up currents in the coils of wire concealed under the carpet. They were wirelessly duplicated by induction in the coil about Miss Ashton's waist, and so affected the receiver under her very becoming hat. Tell the rest, Miss Ashton." "I heard the deal arranged with this Hanford," she added, almost as if she were confessing something. "But, not understanding it as Mr. Kennedy did, I very hastily condemned Mr. Travis. I heard talk of putting back $20,000 into the campaign accounts, of $5,000 given to Hanford for this photographic work, and of the way Mr. Travis was to be defeated whether he paid or not. I heard them say that one condition was that I should carry the purchase money. I heard much that must have confirmed Mr. Kennedy's suspicion in one way, and my own in an opposite way, which I know now was wrong. And then Cadwallader Brown in the studio taunted me cynically, and it cut me, for he seemed right. I hope that Mr. Travis will forgive me for thinking that Mr. Bennett's treachery was his." A terrific cheer broke out among the clerks in the outer office. A boy rushed in with a still unblotted report. Kennedy seized it and read. "McLaughlin concedes the city by a small majority to Travis. 15 election districts estimated. This clinches the Reform League victory in the state." I turned to Travis. He was paying no attention except to the pretty apology of Margaret Ashton. Kennedy drew me to the door. "We might as well concede Miss Ashton to Travis," he said, adding gaily, "by induction of an arm about the waist. Let's go out and watch the crowd." End of The Campaign Grafter. Recording by Elliott Miller. www.voiceofe.com. End of The Poison Pen by Arthur B. Reeve.